In the sunlit rose garden of Rosewood Manor, a perfect afternoon shatters with a single sip. Evelyn Drake, radiant and betrothed, collapses, her teacup laced with cyanide. Was it the spurned lover's bitter revenge, a rival's envy, or a hidden debt settled in poison? Miss Jane Marple, with her quiet knitting and sharper eyes, unravels the secrets of a sugar bowl, a torn letter, and a garden hiding deadly truths. In this elegant dance of deception, one question lingers: whose heart turned tea into murder? Chapter 1. The invitation to Rosewood Manor, in the quiet village of St. Mary Mead. Where the rhythm of life followed the gentle ticking of the church clock, Miss Jane Marple sat in her modest parlour. The morning sun filtered through lace curtains, casting delicate patterns on the polished oak table where her knitting lay a half-finished scarf in soft lavender wool. Her fingers, deft and unhurried, worked the needles with a precision born of habit, while her eyes, bright and observant, followed the world beyond her window. The village was stirring. Mrs. Price, the baker's wife, hurried past with a basket of fresh loaves, and young Tommy Pierce darted across the lane, no doubt up to some harmless mischief. The postman's arrival broke the morning's calm. He slipped a single envelope through the letterbox, its cream-coloured paper standing out against the worn mat. Miss Marple set her knitting aside and retrieved it, noting the elegant, looping script that addressed her by name. The envelope bore the crest of Rosewood Manor, home of Lady Beatrice Harrow, a widow of considerable means and impeccable taste. Inside was an invitation, written in the same graceful hand, requesting Miss Marple's presence at a garden party the following Saturday, an afternoon of fine teas and the season's finest roses. It promised, with a flourish that suggested both pride and expectation. Miss Marple's lips curved into a faint smile. Garden parties, she knew, were more than mere gatherings. They were stages where human nature played out in these, veiled by compliments, rivalries hidden in laughter, and secrets tucked behind polite sips of tea. Lady Beatrice, though charming, was not above hosting such events to display her wealth or settle some subtle score. Miss Marple had met her once at a charity bazaar, and found her gracious but guarded, her eyes betraying a mind that calculated. Every gesture, the invitation intrigued her, not for its promise of roses, but for the undercurrents it might reveal. She rose, smoothing her tweed skirt, and crossed to the mantelpiece, where a small photograph of her nephew Raymond stood beside. A vase of fresh daisies. Raymond, a writer with a penchant for city life, often teased her about her village sleuthing, but even he admitted her knack for seeing what others missed. Miss Marple's mind wandered to Rosewood Manor, its sprawling gardens a contrast to her own modest patch of marigolds. She recalled whispers of Lady Beatrice's niece, Evelyn Drake, a beauty whose recent engagement to a wealthy suitor had set tongues wagging in St. Mary Mead. Such alliances, Miss Marple mused, often stirred. Unrest, the invitation lay open on the table, its edges curling slightly in the warm air. She considered declining. Her rheumatism flared in the afternoons, but curiosity won out. There was something about the timing, the formality of the note, that hinted at more than a social occasion. She fetched her shawl, a soft grey one that matched her practical shoes, and began to plan. Her black notebook, tucked in a drawer, would come along, its pages ready for the small observations that often grew large in significance. She would bring her knitting, too, for it was remarkable how much one could learn while appearing absorbed in stitches. As she resumed her seat, the needles clicking once more, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the guests who might attend. Colonel Bantry, perhaps, with his booming voice and old debts. Clara Voss, the novelist whose sharp pen matched her sharper tongue. Or Dr. Hay, whose medical bag hid a nervous disposition. And Evelyn Drake, of course, whose radiance might mask her own troubles. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly, not in suspicion but in anticipation. People, she knew, were like her knitting each thread connected, each knot a story waiting to be unravelled by noon. She had penned a reply, her handwriting neat and unadorned, accepting Lady Beatrice's invitation. She sealed the envelope and entrusted it to the postman, who tipped his cap as he left. The village carried on outside, oblivious to the faint stirrings in Miss Marple's mind. Rosewood Manor awaited, its roses and teas a backdrop to something unspoken. She picked up her needles, the lavender scarf growing steadily, and prepared herself for an afternoon where the scent of flowers might mingle with the tang of hidden motives. Chapter 2. The rose garden gathering. The sun hung high over Rosewood Manor, its golden rays gilding the sprawling lawns and coaxing a heady perfume from the rose gardens. The estate, nestled in a gentle valley beyond St. Mary Mead, was a vision of ordered beauty, manicured hedges, framed beds of crimson, blush, and ivory roses, their petals trembling in the warm breeze. A pergola draped with climbing vines stood at the garden's heart, its shade offering respite to the guests who gathered for Lady Beatrice Harrow's much-anticipated garden party. Tables draped in crisp white linen dotted the lawn, each adorned with silver teapots, delicate porcelain cups, and a gleaming sugar bowl that caught the light like a polished jewel. The air hummed with the murmur of polite conversation, punctuated by the clink of china and the soft laughter of the well-to-do Miss Jane Marple, seated on a cushioned wicker chair beneath the pergola, adjusted her grey shawl and surveyed the scene with her customary quiet attentiveness. Her knitting lay in her lap, a skein of lavender wool unspooling as her needles moved with unhurried precision. To the casual observer, she was merely an elderly spinster, her white hair neatly pinned, her eyes mild behind spectacles, but those who knew her understood that Miss Marple missed nothing, not the flicker of a glance, nor the pause before a reply, nor the way a hand might linger too long near a teacup. She had arrived at Rosewood Manor with a sense of expectation, and now, as the guests mingled, she felt the familiar prickle of curiosity that told her all was not as serene as it seemed. Lady Beatrice Harrow, resplendent in a lavender silk dress that complemented the roses, moved among her guests with the grace of a seasoned hostess. Her smile was warm, but Miss Marple noted a certain watchfulness in her eyes, as if she were measuring the success of her gathering by some private standard. Lady Beatrice paused to greet Colonel Reginald Bantry, a retired military man whose ruddy face and stiff posture betrayed a life of discipline. He stood near a table, his moustache twitching as he recounted a tale of his days in India to a young couple who nodded politely but seemed eager to escape. The colonel's voice carried its booming cadence cutting through the softer tones around him. Nearby, Clara Voss, the novelist whose acerbic wit had made her both celebrated and feared, held court with a small group. Her dark hair was swept into an elegant chignon, and her green eyes glinted with a sharpness that matched her prose. She wore a tailored suit of deep burgundy, a bold choice for a garden party, and her laughter was a touch too loud, as if calculated to draw attention. Miss Marple, who had read one of Clara's novels, the biting satire of village life, suspected the woman's pen was dipped in personal grudges. Clara's gaze darted occasionally toward Evelyn Drake, Lady Beatrice's niece, who stood at the centre of the lawn, radiant in a cream-coloured dress that shimmered in the sunlight. Evelyn was the undeniable star of the gathering, her auburn hair catching the light as she smiled at the guests who flocked to her side. At 23, she possessed a beauty that was both delicate and commanding, her blue eyes bright with a youthful exuberance that masked a hint of unease. Miss Marple, ever attuned to such subtleties, noticed the way Evelyn's fingers twisted. The stem of her parasol, a nervous habit that belied her outward composure. The village had buzzed with talk of her recent engagement to Roland Tate, a wealthy industrialist whose absence from the party was conspicuous. Evelyn's charm drew admirers, but Miss Marple wondered what shadows lingered behind her poise. Dr. Percival Hay, the village physician, hovered near the tea table. His thin frame stooped slightly as he adjusted his spectacles. His grey suit was immaculate but unremarkable, and his manner was that of a man accustomed to being useful rather than noticed. He had treated Evelyn for nerves in recent months, a fact Miss Marple had gleaned from village gossip, and now he seemed to watch her with a professional concern that bordered on unease. His hands, when not occupied with a teacup, fidgeted with a small notebook, as if he were cataloguing observations of his own. The servants moved with practiced efficiency, their white-gloved hands offering trays of scones, cucumber sandwiches, and petit fours. A young maid, Mary, caught Miss Marple's eye. Her face was pale, her movements precise but tinged with a nervousness that suggested more than the usual strain of service. Mary paused to refill a teapot, her eyes darting toward Evelyn before returning to her task. Miss Marple made a mental note of this, her needles clicking softly as she filed away the observation for later consideration. The tea table nearest Miss Marple was a study in elegance. A silver teapot gleamed beside a matching sugar bowl, its lid engraved with the Harrow crest. Porcelain cups, each painted with delicate rosebuds, sat in neat rows, their saucers pristine. A faint steam rose from the teapot, carrying the earthy scent of herbal tea, a special blend Lady Beatrice had announced, crafted from her own garden's herbs. Miss Marple, who preferred a simple Darjeeling, declined a cup for now, content to observe the hands that reached for the sugar bowl. She noted how Colonel Bantry heaped 2 spoonfuls into his tea, stirring vigorously, while Clara Voss took hers. Black, her lips curling slightly as if sugar were beneath her. The garden was alive with colour and sound. Yet Miss Marple sensed an undercurrent, a tension that rippled beneath the surface of the pleasantries. She had attended enough such gatherings to know that they were fertile ground for hidden motives. A rejected suitor, a slighted friend, a debt unpaid. These were the threads that wove the tapestry of human conflict. Her item text in the middle, suggesting a deeper exploration of the social dynamics at play. As the afternoon wore on, the sun began its slow descent, casting long shadows across the lawn. Evelyn Drake, radiant but restless, moved toward the tea table, her parasol abandoned on a nearby chair. She accepted a cup from Mary, her smile bright but fleeting, and reached for the sugar bowl. Miss Marple watched closely, her eyes narrowing as Evelyn's hand hesitated over the bowl, as if she sensed some unseen danger. The moment passed, and Evelyn stirred a single spoonful of sugar into her tea, her movements graceful but mechanical. She raised the cup to her lips, took a delicate sip, and then another, her expression softening as she turned to respond to a guest's compliment. The conversation around her grew livelier. Clara Voss's voice rose as she recounted a thinly veiled anecdote about a certain young lady whose ambition outstripped her talenter. Barb clearly aimed at Evelyn, who flushed but held her composure. Colonel Bantry, oblivious to the tension, launched into another story, this one about a tiger hunt that had the younger guests stifling yawns. Dr. Hay, meanwhile, hovered near Lady Beatrice, murmuring something about the quality of the tea blend, though his eyes remained fixed on Evelyn. Miss Marple's needles paused briefly as she noted the interplay of glances Clarice sharp, Colonel Bantry's distracted, Dr. Hay's concerned, and Evelyn's guarded. A sudden breeze stirred the roses, sending a cascade of petals drifting. Across the lawn, the guests laughed, some reaching to catch the petals as if they were confetti. Evelyn, still holding her teacup, moved to a quieter corner of the garden, near a trellis heavy with climbing roses. She sipped again, her posture relaxing slightly as she gazed at the blooms. Miss Marple, ever watchful, noticed a figure lingering. Near the edge of the gardener, man, half hidden by a yew hedge, his dark coat out of place among the pastel dresses and light suits. She recognized him as Leonard Gray, the artist whose proposal Evelyn had rejected. His presence was fleeting, his face shadowed, but Miss Marple's sharp memory recalled the bitterness in his eyes at a village fete weeks earlier. The party continued, the hum of voices blending with the distant song of a thrush. Lady Beatrice circulated, her lavender dress catching the light as she ensured every guest felt attended. She paused to compliment Miss Marple on her scarf, remarking on the charming simplicity of her knitting. Miss Marple smiled, deflecting the praise with a modest remark, but her mind was elsewhere, piecing together the mosaic of glances, gestures, and unspoken words. She had no evidence of wrongdoing, only the instinct honed by years of observing. Human nature, something, she felt certain, was amiss. Evelyn returned to the tea table, her cup nearly empty. She reached for the sugar bowl once more, adding another spoonful with a distracted air. The silver lid clinked softly as she replaced it, and Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the bowl, its polished surface reflecting the fading light. There was nothing to suggest it was anything but ordinary, yet Miss Marple's intuition stirred a faint, unplaceable unease that would not be dismissed. The garden party was at its peak, the guests basking in the glow of summer and sociability. Lady Beatrice raised a toast to her roses, her voice carrying a note of triumph as she praised their beauty. The guests lifted their cups, the porcelain gleaming, the tea steaming gently. Evelyn joined the toast, her smile bright but her eyes distant. Miss Marple, her knitting resumed FedEx, watched as Evelyn took another sip, her movements graceful, but tinged with that same nervous energy. The thrush's song faded, replaced by a sudden silence that seemed to hang over the garden, unnoticed by all but Miss Marple. Chapter 3. The Fatal Sip de Rose Garden of Rosewood Manor. Moments ago, alive with the hum of polite conversation and the clink of porcelain, now lay under a pall of stunned silence. Evelyn Drake, radiant in her cream-coloured dress, had been standing near a trellis laden with crimson roses, her auburn hair catching the late afternoon sun. She held a delicate teacup, its rosebud pattern glinting as she raised it to her lips. The guests, scattered across the lawn, were absorbed in their own small dramas. Colonel Bantry's booming tales of colonial exploits, Clara Voss's barbed witticisms, Lady Beatrice Harrow's graceful orchestration of her garden party. None noticed the subtle shift in Evelyn's demeanour, a slight hesitation as she sipped, a fleeting frown, and then a sudden, choking gasp. Miss Jane Marple, seated beneath the vine-draped pergola, paused her knitting, her lavender wool scarf forgotten as her sharp eyes caught the change. Evelyn's hand flew to her throat, her fingers clawing at the air as if grasping for breath. The teacup slipped from her grasp, shattering on the stone path with a brittle crash, its contents spilling in a dark stain across the pale gravel. A faint, bitter scent, sharp and reminiscent of almonds, rose from the broken shards. Evelyn's knees buckled, her dress billowing like a fallen sail as she collapsed onto the grass, her face drained of colour, her blue eyes wide with terror. A single rose petal, dislodged by the breeze, settled on her outstretched hand. The garden erupted into chaos. A woman screamed, Clara Voss, her voice piercing the stunned silence. Guests turned, their faces a gallery of shock and confusion. Lady Beatrice, standing near the tea table, froze, her lavender silk dress shimmering as her hand rose to her mouth. Colonel Bantry, mid-sentence about a tiger hunt, faltered, his ruddy face paling beneath his moustache. Dr. Percival Hay, the village physician, reacted first, his thin frame cutting through the crowd with a speed that belied his usual hesitancy. He knelt beside Evelyn, his fingers searching for a pulse, first at her wrist, then her neck. His spectacles glinted as he shook his head, his voice low but firm. She's gone. There's nothing to be done. Miss Marple, her grey shawl slipping slightly, rose from her wicker chair and approached with measured steps. Her knitting lay abandoned, the needles glinting in the sunlight. To the casual observer, she was merely a frail old woman, her white hair neatly pinned, her spectacles unassuming. But her eyes, bright and unyielding, missed nothing. The shattered teacup, its rosebud pattern now fractured, the untouched second cup on the nearby table, its contents cooling, and the faint, acrid scent that lingered in the air, distinct from the herbal tea's earthy aroma. She stooped slightly, as if adjusting her shawl, and inhaled. The almond-like odour was unmistakable, a hallmark of something far more sinister than a garden mishap. Cyanide, her mind whispered, though she kept the thought to herself. The guests hovered, some pressing closer, others retreating as if death were contagious. Clara Voss, her burgundy suit stark against the pastel crowd, clutched a handkerchief, her green eyes darting from Evelyn's body to the tea table. Poison, she whispered, loud enough to ripple through the crowd. The word ignited murmurs, a wave of speculation that spread like wildfire. Colonel Bantry, recovering his composure, barked, "Nonsense. It must be a fit heart trouble, perhaps." But his voice lacked conviction, and his eyes lingered on the broken teacup. Lady Beatrice, her hostess's poise fraying, stepped forward, her voice trembling. "This is impossible. No one here would do such a thing. It must be an accident." Dr. Hay, still kneeling, looked up, his face ashen. "I'm afraid it's no accident, Lady Beatrice. That smell bitter almonds. It's suggestive of cyanide." His words, clinical but heavy, silenced the murmurs. The guests exchanged glances, some horrified, others calculating. Miss Marple, standing quietly to the side, noted the reactions. Clara's quick intake of breath, Colonel Bantry's sudden stillness, Lady Beatrice's clenched hands. The young maid, Mary, who had served the tea, stood frozen near the table, her tray trembling in her hands. Her pale face, already strained, now bore a look of dread that Miss Marple filed away for later scrutiny. The tea table, moments ago a symbol of elegance, now seemed an altar of tragedy. The silver teapot gleamed, its spout still steaming faintly. The sugar bowl, its lid engraved with the Harrow crest, sat innocently beside a tray of untouched scones. 2 teacups had been in use, Evelyn's, now shattered, and another untouched, its contents undisturbed. Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the sugar bowl, its polished surface reflecting the fading light. She recalled Evelyn's gesture. A spoonful of sugar into her tea, her hands steady but her expression distracted. Had the poison been in the tea itself, or in something added? The almond-like scent suggested a deliberate act, but the method remained elusive. Lady Beatrice, regaining her composure, addressed the guests. "Please, everyone, move to the drawing room. We mustn't disturb the scene." Her voice wavered, but her authority held. The guests, reluctant but obedient, began to drift toward the manor, their whispers growing louder as they distanced themselves from Evelyn's body. Colonel Bantry lingered, muttering about damned foul play, while Clara Voss clutched her handkerchief tighter, her eyes scanning the crowd as if searching for a culprit. Dr. Hay remained by Evelyn's side, his medical bag open, though he seemed at a loss for what to do. Miss Marple, unnoticed by most, stayed near the tea table, her gaze sweeping the ground for anything out of place. The young maid, Mary, approached to clear the table, her movements mechanical. Miss Marple, with a gentle smile, touched her arm. "Leave it, dear. The police will want to see everything as it is." Mary started, her eyes wide, and nodded, retreating with her tray. Miss Marple's kindness was deliberate. She had seen the girl's nervousness earlier, and now, in the wake of tragedy, that unease seemed magnified. A servant, she knew, often saw more than their masters realized. Conversations overheard, glances exchanged, small acts that went unnoticed in the bustle of a household. As the guests moved indoors, Miss Marple lingered, her eyes returning to the shattered teacup. The almond-like scent was fainter now, dissipating in the open air, but it confirmed her suspicions. Cyanide was a poison of intent, not accident, and its presence in a garden party suggested a mind both bold and cunning. She glanced at the second teacup, its contents untouched, and wondered who it had been meant for. Had Evelyn been the sole target, or was the poison meant to cast a wider net? The sugar bowl, so innocently central to the tea ritual, drew her attention again. Its lid, she noted, was slightly askew, as if replaced in haste. A small detail, but in Miss Marple's experience, small details were the threads that unravelled the tightest knots. The sound of footsteps on the gravel path announced the arrival of Inspector Craddock, a young man with a reputation for thoroughness, though Miss Marple suspected he sometimes missed the subtler currents of human behaviour. He arrived with a constable, his notebook already open, his expression grim but professional. Lady Beatrice, now composed, met him at the garden's edge, explaining the tragedy in clipped tones. Evelyn was perfectly well, she insisted. She sipped her tea, and then this. "It's unthinkable," Craddock nodded, his eyes scanning the scene. He approached Dr. Hay, who stood now, brushing grass from his knees. "Cyanide, you say?" Craddock's voice was steady, but his brow furrowed. "How certain are you?" Dr. Hay adjusted his spectacles, his hands trembling slightly. "The smell is distinctive. Bitter almonds. I've seen it once before, in my early practice. There's no mistaking it." He gestured to the broken teacup, its shards scattered like a grim mosaic. Craddock crouched, sniffing cautiously, then nodded. "We'll need the coroner to confirm, but this looks deliberate. No one else is ill." "No," Lady Beatrice said quickly. "Everyone else is fine. It must have been her cup alone." Her voice held a note of desperation, as if willing the tragedy to be contained. Miss Marple, standing quietly nearby, thought otherwise. A poisoner bold enough to strike at a garden party might not limit themselves to one victim. She glanced at the second teacup, its presence nagging at her. Why had it been left untouched? Was it a mistake or part of the plan? Craddock began his questions, his constable scribbling notes. The guests, now gathered in the drawing-room, were summoned one by one. Colonel Bantry, blustering but cooperative, claimed he'd been regaling a group with stories and hadn't noticed Evelyn's distress until the scream. Clara Voss, her voice sharp but controlled, admitted she'd seen Evelyn sip her tea, but insisted she'd been too far away to notice anything unusual. Dr. Hay, still shaken, recounted his futile attempt to revive her, his medical training no match for the poison's speed. Lady Beatrice, her composure fraying, repeated that no one at her party could have done such a thing. "We're all friends here," she said, but her eyes betrayed doubt. Miss Marple, unnoticed by the bustling inspector, moved closer to the tea table, her steps slow and deliberate. She bent to examine the ground, her fingers brushing the grass. Near the shattered teacup, a single sugar cube, half crushed, lay among the shards, its granules sparkling unnaturally in the sunlight. She did not touch it, knowing the police would need to examine it, but her mind raced. The sugar bowl, so central to the ritual of tea, was the perfect vehicle for poison accessible to all, yet unnoticed in its ordinariness. Had someone tampered with it, knowing Evelyn's habit of sweetening her tea, or was the poison in the cup itself prepared in advance? The inspector, finishing his initial survey, approached Miss Marple, his expression polite but dismissive. "Miss Marple, isn't it? You were here when it happened." His tone suggested he expected little of value from an elderly spinster. Miss Marple smiled, her eyes crinkling. "I was, Inspector. A terrible thing. I couldn't help but notice the smell from the teacup. Most unusual." She offered no more, knowing he would pursue his own methods for now. Craddock nodded, jotting a note, and moved on to question Mary, who stood trembling at the gardens. Edged up, Miss Marple returned to her chair, retrieving her knitting but not resuming it. Her mind was too busy piecing together the fragments of the afternoon. Evelyn's nervous demeanour, the almond-like scent, the untouched second teacup, the sugar bowl's askew lid, these were clues, small but significant. She thought of the guests, Clara Voss, whose sharp tongue hid a deeper resentment, Colonel Bantry, whose calm exterior might mask old debts or grudges, Dr. Hay, whose concern seemed tinged with guilt, and Leonard Gray, the spurned suitor whose brief appearance at the garden's edge lingered in her memory. Someone had orchestrated this tragedy with chilling precision, and Miss Marple knew the answer lay not in the grand gestures but in the quiet moments, the glance, the pause, the misplaced lid, as the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the lawn. The guests remained in the drawing-room, their voices a low hum of speculation and fear. Evelyn's body, covered now with a sheet brought by a servant, lay like a silent accusation. The roses, their beauty undimmed, swayed in the breeze, their scent mingling with the fading trace of almonds. Miss Marple's needles remained still, her eyes fixed on the tea-table. The garden party, so carefully planned, had become a stage for murder, and she knew the curtain had only just risen on the drama to come. Chapter 4. The Inspector's Arrival, the Rose Garden of Rosewood Manor. So recently, a tableau of elegance and mirth now lay under a sombre veil. The late afternoon light, softening to a golden haze, cast long shadows across the lawn where Evelyn Drake's body rested, covered by a white sheet that fluttered faintly in the breeze. The shattered teacup, its rosebud pattern broken into jagged pieces, lay scattered on the stone path, a grim reminder of the tragedy that had unfolded. The faint, bitter scent of almonds lingered, though it was fading now, overtaken by the heavy perfume of the roses. The guests, shepherded into the manor's drawing room by Lady Beatrice Harrow's trembling but resolute command, left the garden eerily quiet, save for the distant trill of a thrush and the rustle of leaves. Miss Jane Marple stood near the tea table, her grey shawl draped neatly over her shoulders, her lavender knitting abandoned on the wicker chair beneath the pergola. Her spectacles glinted as she surveyed the scene, her eyes sharp and unyielding despite the mild demeanour that made her so easily overlooked. The sugar bowl, its silver surface polished to a mirror-like sheen, sat innocently beside the untouched second teacup, its contents cooling in the evening air. The almond-like scent from Evelyn's broken cup had confirmed her suspicions of cyanide, a poison both swift and deliberate. Her mind, disciplined and curious, turned over the details. Evelyn's nervous sip, the askew lid of the sugar bowl, the fleeting glimpse of Leonard Gray at the garden's edge. Each was a thread in a tapestry she was only beginning to weave. The crunch of gravel announced the arrival of Inspector Craddock, a man in his late 30s whose brisk efficiency was tempered by a certain rigidity of thought. He stepped into the garden with a constable at his side, his dark suit a stark contrast to the pastel hues of the party. His notebook was already open, his pencil poised, and his expression was one of grim determination. Lady Beatrice, her lavender dress now slightly creased, met him at the garden's entrance, her face pale but composed. "Inspector, thank you for coming so quickly," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. It's unthinkable. Evelyn was so young, so vibrant. This must be some dreadful mistake." Craddock nodded, his eyes scanning the scene. "I'm afraid, Lady Beatrice, that Dr. Hay's mention of cyanide suggests otherwise. We'll need to examine everything carefully." He gestured to the constable, who began cordoning off the area around Evelyn's body with a quiet efficiency. Dr. Percival Hay, still hovering near the sheet-covered form, looked up, his spectacles reflecting the fading light. "I've done all I can, Inspector," he said, his voice low. "The smell, bitter almonds. It's unmistakable. I've seen it once before, years ago. Cyanide acts quickly, too quickly for intervention." Miss Marple, standing a discreet distance away, listened without comment, her hands folded calmly. She noted the doctor's pallor, the slight shake in his hands as he adjusted his medical bag. His quick identification of the poison was professional, yet there was a nervousness in his manner that piqued her interest. Was it merely the shock of the moment, or something deeper? She filed the thought away, her eyes drifting back to the tea table. Craddock crouched beside the broken teacup, careful not to disturb the shards. He leaned forward, sniffing cautiously, then straightened, his brow furrowed. Definitely an unusual odor. "We'll have the fragments sent for analysis, but this supports the doctor's theory." He turned to Lady Beatrice, who prepared the tea and who had access to the table. Lady Beatrice's lips tightened. The servants handled the tea, of course. Mary, the maid, served it, and the cook, Mrs. Benton, prepared the blend. "It's a special herbal mix from our garden, nothing harmful, I assure you. As for the table, well, it was out here for all to see. Anyone could have approached it." Her voice faltered, as if the implication of her words struck her anew. "But surely no one here would do such a thing. These are my friends, my neighbours." Craddock's pencil scratched against his notebook. "We'll need to speak to everyone present. No one is to leave until we've taken statements." He glanced at the constable, who nodded and moved toward the manor to ensure compliance. The inspector's eyes then fell on Miss Marple, who stood quietly, her expression one of mild concern. "Miss Marple, isn't it? You were here when it happened. Did you see anything unusual?" Miss Marple's smile was gentle, disarming. "I'm afraid I'm not much for noticing things, Inspector. I was busy with my knitting, you see. But I did see poor Evelyn take her tea, and she seemed quite herself, until she wasn't. Her tone was vague, but her eyes were keen, watching Craddock's reaction. He nodded, jotting a note, clearly underestimating her, as most did. She preferred it that way. It allowed her to observe unhindered. The inspector moved to the tea table, examining the silver teapot, the sugar bowl, and the second teacup. "This other cup," he said, pointing to the untouched one. "Whose was it?" Lady Beatrice hesitated, then shook her head. "I'm not sure. Several guests took tea, but not everyone drank at once. It could belong to anyone." Craddock frowned, his fingers brushing the sugar bowl's lid. Miss Marple, standing nearby, noted that he did not remark on its slight misalignment, a detail she had already catalogued. "We'll have this tested as well," he said, gesturing to the constable to bag the items carefully. Inside the manor, the guests had gathered in the drawing room, a spacious chamber with tall windows overlooking the garden. The air was thick with tension, the earlier gaiety replaced by whispered speculation and uneasy glances. Colonel Reginald Bantry sat in a high-backed chair, his hands clasped tightly, his face set in a mask of indignation. "This is outrageous," he muttered to no one in particular. "Poison at a garden party. It's like something out of one of those blasted novels." His eyes flicked toward Clara Voss, who stood by a window, her burgundy suit a vivid contrast to the pale curtains. She clutched a cigarette, her fingers trembling as she lit it, her sharp green eyes scanning the room. Clara's voice, when she spoke, was edged with sarcasm. "Well, Colonel, perhaps you're right. Life does imitate art, doesn't it? Poor Evelyn, the heroine of her own tragedy." Her words were meant to provoke, and they did. Colonel Bantry's moustache bristled, but he said nothing. Miss Marple, who had quietly entered the room, took a seat near the fireplace, her knitting retrieved but untouched. She observed Clara's calculated nonchalance, the way her gaze lingered on certain guests, Dr. Hay, who sat hunched over his notebook, and Lady Beatrice, who paced near the door, her composure fraying. Dr. Hay, his grey suit rumpled from his earlier efforts, scribbled in his notebook, though Miss Marple doubted he was recording anything of medical significance. His nervous energy was palpable, his fingers tapping the page as if to steady himself. She recalled village gossip about his treatment of Evelyn for nerves. Had he known more about her state of mind than he let on? His quick diagnosis of cyanide was impressive, but it also raised questions. Had he encountered the poison before, or was his knowledge merely academic? The young maid, Mary, entered with a tray of water glasses, her face pale and her movements stiff. Miss Marple watched her closely, noting the way her eyes avoided the guests, particularly Clara Voss, who had snapped at her earlier for a spilled tray. Mary set the glasses down and retreated quickly, but not before Miss Marple caught a fleeting look of fear in her expression. Servants, Miss Marple knew, were the invisible threads of a household, weaving through rooms and conversations, privy to secrets their masters overlooked. She made a mental note to speak with Mary later, when the girl's nerves might be less frayed. Craddock began his interviews, calling guests one by one to a small study off the drawing room. Colonel Bantry went first, his voice carrying through the closed door as he insisted he'd been too busy telling stories to notice anything amiss. "I was halfway through my tale about the Bengal tiger," he boomed, when that scream interrupted. "Damned shame, poor girl." His alibi was vague, as were those of most guests. The garden's open layout allowed for free movement, making it impossible to pin anyone to a specific spot. Clara Voss, when summoned, was brisk and defiant. "I saw Evelyn take her tea, yes, but I was talking to Mrs. Langley about her dreadful hat. I didn't see anything unusual until she fell." Her tone was dismissive, but Miss Marple noted the way her fingers twisted the cigarette, betraying a nervousness her words concealed. Dr. Hay, next, repeated his account of the cyanide scent, adding that he'd tried to administer aid but found no pulse. "It was over in seconds," he said, his voice hollow. "I've never seen anything so swift." Craddock pressed him on the poisoned source, but Hay shook his head. "It could be anywhere chemicals, pest control. It's not uncommon in large estates." Lady Beatrice, interviewed last, was adamant that her household was above reproach. "My servants are loyal, Inspector, and my guests, well, they're respectable people. This must be some tragic error." But her eyes, darting toward the drawing room, suggested she was less certain than she claimed. Miss Marple, listening from her corner, thought of the sugar bowl, its lid askew, and the fleeting figure of Leonard Gray. He had not been among the guests in the drawing room, and his absence was as telling as his earlier presence, as Craddock concluded his initial round of questions. Miss Marple slipped out to the garden, where the constable stood guard over the cordoned-off area. The sheet over Evelyn's body was stark against the green lawn, and the tea table, now surrounded by tape, looked forlorn. Miss Marple's eyes returned to the sugar bowl, its silver surface catching the last rays of sunlight. She recalled Evelyn's habit of sweetening her tea, a small gesture that had proved fatal. The second teacup, untouched, nagged at her. Had it been meant for someone else, or was it a decoy? The poison's delivery suggested a plan both bold and precise, and Miss Marple knew the key lay in the mundane details: a spoonful of sugar, a misplaced lid, a glance exchanged in the crowd. Back in the drawing room, the guests sat in uneasy silence, their earlier camaraderie shattered. Colonel Bantry stared at the fireplace, his hands clasped tightly. Clara Voss lit another cigarette, her eyes narrowing as she watched Lady Beatrice whisper to a servant. Dr. Hay closed his notebook, his fingers still tapping nervously. Miss Marple resumed her seat, her knitting untouched, her mind racing. She thought of St. Mary Mead, where small betrayals, a stolen letter, a whispered rumour had taught her the patterns of human malice. This was no different, only grander, in scale, with roses and silver teapots as the backdrop. The inspector, returning from the study, addressed the group. "We'll need to search the premises and take samples from the tea and sugar. No one leaves until we've cleared you." His tone was firm, but Miss Marple sensed his frustration. The alibis were too fluid, the scene too open. She caught his eye and offered a small nod, as if to reassure him, though she knew he would not yet seek her counsel. That would come later, when the facts alone failed to yield answers. As the evening deepened, the garden took on a mournful air, the roses, scent now, heavy with the weight of tragedy. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to Leonard Gray, whose absence was a glaring omission. Had he slipped away after tampering with the sugar bowl, or was his role more subtle? She recalled the village gossip about his rejection by Evelyn, the bitterness in his eyes at the fate. Love, she knew, could twist into something dark, and a spurned heart was a dangerous thing. The constable began collecting the tea-table items, sealing the sugar bowl and teapot in bags. Miss Marple watched, her mind tracing the path of the poison. The sugar bowl, so central to the ritual, was the likely vehicle accessible to all, yet unnoticed in its familiarity. But who had the opportunity, and the motive, to lace it with cyanide? Clara's resentment, Colonel Bantry's debts, Dr. Hay's nervousness. Leonard's absence each was a piece of the puzzle, but the picture was not yet clear. Miss Marple returned to her knitting, her needles clicking softly, a rhythm that steadied her thoughts. The drawing-room was a microcosm of motives, each guest a study in hidden depths. She would watch and listen and wait. The truth, she knew, lay not in the grand gestures but in the small ones, the tremble of a hand, the flicker of a glance. The lid of a sugar bowl left askew. As the manor settled into an uneasy quiet, Miss Marple's mind was anything but still, already weaving the threads of a tragedy that had only begun to unfold. Chapter 5. The servants' whisper, the drawing-room of Rosewood Manor, with its tall windows and polished mahogany, had become a cage of whispers and sidelong glances. The guests, confined by Inspector Craddock's orders, sat in uneasy clusters, their earlier gaiety replaced by a palpable tension. The fire in the hearth cast flickering shadows on the walls, lending an air of unease to the once elegant space. Colonel Bantry, his ruddy face set in a scowl, muttered about the indignity of being detained. Clara Voss, her burgundy suit stark, against the pale upholstery, smoked incessantly, her sharp eyes darting from one guest to another. Dr. Percival Hay, his notebook now tucked away, sat with his hands clasped tightly, as if to still their trembling. Lady Beatrice Harrow, her lavender dress creased from pacing, moved between groups, offering hollow reassurances that did little to ease the atmosphere. Miss Jane Marple, seated in a corner near the fireplace, appeared absorbed in her knitting, the lavender wool scarf growing steadily under her deft fingers. Her spectacles glinted in the firelight, but her eyes were not on her needles. They roamed the room, noting the small gestures that betrayed hidden thoughts. Clara's quick glance at the door, Colonel Bantry's fidgeting with his cufflinks, Dr. Hay's repeated adjustments of his spectacles. To the casual observer, Miss Marple was merely an elderly spinster, her presence unobtrusive, her thoughts inconsequential, but her mind, sharp and disciplined, was piecing together the fragments of the afternoon's tragedy. Evelyn Drake's collapse, the almond-like scent of cyanide, the sugar bowl's askew lid, and the absence of Leonard Gray, the spurned suitor whose shadow lingered in her memory. The young maid, Mary, entered the room with a fresh tray of water glasses, her movements cautious, her face pale as moonlight. Miss Marple had noticed her earlier in the garden, her nervous demeanour standing out amid the bustle of service. Now, as Mary set the tray on a side table, her hands trembled and her eyes avoided the guests, particularly Clara Voss, who had earlier snapped at her for a minor spill. Miss Marple, with the gentle air of a kindly aunt, caught the girl's attention as she passed. "Mary, dear, you must be quite shaken after such a dreadful event," she said, her voice soft but inviting confidence. Mary hesitated, her fingers twisting the edge of her apron, then nodded slightly, her eyes darting to the floor. "It's awful," Miss Mary whispered, barely audible. "Miss Evelyn was so kind." I can't believe she's gone." Her voice broke, and Miss Marple, sensing an opportunity, patted the seat beside her. "Sit for a moment, dear. You've been run off your feet." Mary glanced nervously toward Lady Beatrice, who was distracted by a conversation with Craddock, then perched on the edge of the chair, her posture rigid. Miss Marple's needles clicked rhythmically, a soothing sound that seemed to ease Mary's tension. "You see a great deal, don't you, working here?" she said, her tone conversational, as if discussing the weather. "Servants often do, though no one thinks to ask them." Mary's eyes widened, a flicker of surprise crossing her face. She nodded, almost imperceptibly, and leaned closer. "I do, miss. Things folks don't think I notice. But I keep my head down, like Mrs. Benton says." Miss Marple smiled, her eyes crinkling with encouragement. "And did you notice anything last night, perhaps, before the party?" Her question was gentle, but her gaze was keen, watching the girl's reaction. Mary's fingers tightened on her apron, and for a moment she seemed to weigh whether to speak. Then, in a rush of whispered words, she confided, "I heard something, miss, last night, in the library. Mr. Gray, Mr. Leonard Gray, that is, was talking to Miss Evelyn. It was late, after dinner, and I was tidying the hall. I didn't mean to listen, but their voices carried." Miss Marple's needles paused, though her expression remained unchanged. "Mr. Gray, you say, and what did you hear?" Her voice was calm, but her mind was alert, ready to seize on any detail. Mary swallowed, her voice dropping lower. "He was angry. Miss said she'd led him on, made promises she didn't keep. He said she'd regret choosing Mr. Tate over him." His voice was so cold, it gave me chills. "Miss Evelyn tried to calm him, but he stormed out, saying something about making her see. I didn't think much of it then, but now." Her words trailed off, her eyes filling with tears. Miss Marple nodded, her face sympathetic but her thoughts racing. Leonard Gray's rejection by Evelyn, followed by his ominous words, painted a picture of motive as clear as the roses in the garden. She recalled his fleeting presence at the party's edge, his dark coat out of place among the light summer attire. "You've done well to tell me, Mary," she said softly. "It's a small thing, perhaps, but small things matter. Don't speak of it to anyone else just yet." Mary nodded, relieved to have unburdened herself, and slipped back to her duties, her tray forgotten. The drawing room remained a hive of suppressed tension. Inspector Craddock, having completed his initial interviews, stood near the door, conferring with his constable. His notebook was filled with vague alibis and contradictory details. The open layout of the garden party made it impossible to pinpoint anyone's movements with certainty. Colonel Bantry had been regaling a group with stories. Clara Voss had been critiquing hats. Dr. Hay had been sipping tea near Lady Beatrice. Each account was plausible, yet none was verifiable. Craddock's frustration was evident in the set of his jaw, though he maintained his professional demeanour. Miss Marple, her knitting resumed, considered Mary's revelation. Leonard Gray's anger, coupled with his absence from the drawing room, made him a compelling figure in the unfolding drama. She thought of St. Mary Mead, where a spurned suitor had once set fire to a rival's Eureka petty act, but rooted in the same bitter passion that might drive a man to poison. Yet she cautioned herself against haste. The sugar bowl, the likely vehicle for the cyanide, had been accessible to all. Leonard's motive was strong, but opportunity was not exclusive to him. Clara Voss's sharp tongue, Colonel Bantry's guarded demeanour, Dr. Hay's nervous scribbling itch suggested secrets of their own. Lady Beatrice, her composure strained, approached Miss Marple, perhaps seeking the comfort of a familiar face. "This is a nightmare, Miss Marple," she said, her voice low. "Evelyn was like a daughter to me. Who could do such a thing?" Her eyes, red-rimmed, searched Miss Marple's face for answers. Miss Marple set her knitting aside, her expression one of quiet sympathy. "It's a terrible shock, Lady Beatrice, but the truth has a way of coming to light, often through the smallest details. Tell me, did Evelyn seem herself today, or was she troubled?" Lady Beatrice hesitated, her fingers twisting a lace handkerchief. She was quieter than usual. She spoke of her engagement to Roland Tate, but there was no joy in it. "I thought it was just nerves, such a big step, you know. But now I wonder." Her voice faltered, and she turned away, as if afraid to voice her suspicions. Miss Marple noted the pause, sensing that Lady Beatrice knew more than she was willing to say. A family secret, perhaps, or a fear of implicating someone close. The drawing-room door opened, and Craddock summoned Clara Voss for a second interview. She stubbed out her cigarette with a deliberate gesture and followed him, her posture defiant. Miss Marple watched her go, recalling Clara's barbed comment about Evelyn at the party, a thinly veiled jab at her ambition. Clara's novels, she knew, were laced with venom, often drawn from real-life slights. Had Evelyn's public mockery of her work stung deeply enough to provoke murder? It seemed unlikely, yet Miss Marple had seen lesser grievances lead to greater. Crime's Colonel Bantry, meanwhile, had taken to pacing near the windows, his hands clasped behind his back. His military bearing was intact, but his eyes betrayed a restlessness that Miss Marple found intriguing. Village gossip had mentioned a debt owed to Evelyn's late father, a matter of honour that might weigh heavily on a man like the Colonel. Was his calm exterior a mask for guilt, or merely the stoicism of a soldier? She made a mental note to inquire further, perhaps through Dolly Bantry, his wife, who was a font of indiscreet chatter. Dr. Hay, seated across the room, had reopened his notebook, though his pen remained idle. His earlier diagnosis of cyanide had been swift, almost too swift, and Miss Marple wondered about his familiarity with the poison. As the village physician, he had access to chemicals, though cyanide was not a common medical tool. His treatment of Evelyn for nerves suggested a closer connection to her than he had admitted. Had she confided in him about her fears, her suitors, her doubts? His nervous demeanour suggested a man burdened by more than professional failure. The clock on the mantel struck 6, its chimes a sombre reminder of time's passage. The guests, restless now, murmured among themselves, their voices a low hum of speculation. "Poison at a garden party," one woman whispered. "It's like something out of a novel." Clara Voss, returning from her interview, overheard and smirked, though her eyes remained wary. Craddock, emerging from the study, looked wary but determined. "We'll need to search the premises," he announced. "The sugar bowl and tea. Samples are being sent for analysis. If anyone remembers anything, I'll come forward now." Miss Marple, her knitting a steady rhythm, considered approaching Craddock with Mary's information but decided against it. The inspector, though competent, preferred tangible evidence to servants' whispers, and she needed more to connect Leonard Gray to the sugar bowl. She thought of the second teacup, untouched on the table, and wondered if it held a clue to the poisoner's intent. Had Evelyn been the sole target, or was the poison meant for another? The open nature of the tea table made it a perfect stage for murder, but also a risky one. Anyone might have taken the fatal cup. As the evening deepened, the drawing room grew stifling, the air thick with unspoken accusations. Miss Marple slipped out to the hall, seeking a moment of quiet to order her thoughts. She found Mary near the kitchen door, polishing a silver tray with unnecessary vigor. "Mary," she said softly, "you've been very brave. If you hear anything else, anything at all, you'll tell me, won't you?" Mary nodded, her eyes grateful but still fearful. Miss Marple returned to the drawing room, her mind turning over the servant's whisper. Leonard Gray's words, she regret choosing Mr. Tate, were a motive, but not yet proof. The sugar bowl, the cyanide, the untouched cup, these were the pieces of a puzzle that required patience to assemble. Back in her corner, Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her needles, a quiet metronome. The guests, unaware of her scrutiny, continued their uneasy vigil, each a potential player in the tragedy. Clara's resentment, Colonel Bantry's debts, Dr. Hay's nerves, Leonard's absence, each was a thread, and Miss Marple was determined to follow them to their source. The fire crackled, casting shadows that danced like secrets, and she knew the truth was there, hidden in the ordinary moments of a garden party turned deadly. Chapter 6. The Sugar Bowls, Secret. The twilight had settled over Rosewood Manor, casting a soft melancholic glow over the rose garden where the tragedy had unfolded. The once vibrant scene of the garden party, with its laughter and clinking teacups, was now a sombre tableau, cordoned off by the constable's tape. Evelyn Drake's body, still covered by a white sheet, lay near the trellis, a silent sentinel amid the roses' fading perfume. The tea table, stripped of its silver, teapot and sugar bowl by Inspector Craddock's orders, stood forlorn, its white cloth fluttering in the evening breeze. The second teacup, untouched and solitary, remained on the table, a mute witness to the afternoon's horror. Miss Jane Marple, having slipped away from the stifling drawing-room, stood in the manor's vast kitchen, where the air was thick with the scent of baking bread and the faint tang of herbs. Her grey shawl was draped neatly over her shoulders, and her knitting bag rested at her feet, though she had no intention of knitting now. Her presence in the kitchen was deliberate. She had requested to see whether tea was prepared, a request Lady Beatrice had granted with a distracted nod, too overwhelmed to question the elderly spinster's curiosity. Miss Marple's spectacles glinted in the lamplight as she surveyed the room, her eyes sharp and searching, missing nothing. The kitchen was a hive of activity, despite the hour. Mrs. Benton, the cook, a stout woman with flour-dusted hands and a nonsense air, was supervising the preparation of a light supper for the detained guests. Two maids bustled about, their faces strained, their movements hurried. Mary, the young maid who had confided in Miss Marple about Leonard Gray's heated words, was absent, likely tending to tasks elsewhere. Miss Marple's request to inspect the kitchen had been met with mild surprise, but Mrs. Benton, accustomed to deference, had agreed without protest. "It's a terrible business, miss," she said, wiping her hands on her apron. Miss Evelyn was a sweet girl who'd want to harm her. Miss Marple nodded sympathetically, her expression one of gentle concern. "It's quite dreadful, Mrs. Benton. I thought it might help the inspector to know how the tea was prepared. Such a small thing, but it could matter." Her voice was soft, disarming, and Mrs. Benton relaxed, eager to share what she knew. "The tea was my own blend," she said proudly. "Herbs from the garden, chamomile, mint, a touch of lavender. I steeped it this morning, and Mary took it out to the table. Nothing harmful in it, I swear." Miss Marple's eyes drifted to a shelf where a silver sugar bowl sat, identical to the one from the garden but empty, its lid gleaming under the kitchen lamp. "And the sugar?" she asked, her tone casual. Mrs. Benton frowned, her hands pausing. I filled the bowl myself this morning. Fresh sugar from the pantry, same as always. I set it out for Mary to take to the table. No one touched it but me, far as I know. Her voice was firm, but Miss Marple noted a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes, as if she were replaying the morning's routine. Moving closer to the sugar bowl, Miss Marple bent slightly, as if adjusting her shawl, and examined its lid. Like the one in the garden, it was slightly askew, a detail so small it might have gone unnoticed by anyone less observant. She did not touch it, knowing the police would need to examine it, but her mind seized on the anomaly. This bowl, she said, pointing to it, is it the one used today? Mrs. Benton shook her head. No, miss. That's a spare. The one from the gardens with the police now. But they're the same part of a set Lady Beatrice inherited. Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts racing. The askew lid in the garden had suggested haste or carelessness, and now its twin bore the same imperfection. Was it a coincidence or a clue to the poisoner's method? Cyanide, she knew, could be disguised in sugar's granular texture, dissolving seamlessly into tea. The sugar bowl, accessible to all yet unnoticed in its familiarity, was the perfect vehicle for murder. But who had the opportunity to tamper with it, and when? The morning's preparations, Mrs. Benton's routine. Mary's delivery each offered a window, however brief, for a cunning hand to act. She thanked Mrs. Benton and stepped into the servants' corridor, a narrow passage lined with shelves of linens and cleaning supplies. The quiet here was a stark contrast to the kitchen's bustle, allowing her thoughts to settle. Mary's whispered confession about Leonard Gray's angry words, she'd regret choosing Mr. Tate, echoed in her mind. It was a motive as clear as the rose's crimson, but Miss Marple cautioned herself against haste. In St. Mary Mead, she had seen how passion could cloud judgment, yet other motives and vedette, fear could be just as potent. Clara Voss's sharp wit, Colonel Bantry's guarded air, Dr. Hay's nervous scribbling, each hinted at secrets yet to be uncovered. Returning to the drawing room, Miss Marple found the guests still confined, their patience fraying like worn thread. The fire had dwindled to embers, casting a dim glow over the room's polished surfaces. Colonel Bantry stood by a window, his hands clasped behind him, his military bearing strained by restlessness. Clara Voss, her cigarette extinguished, clutched a book she wasn't reading, her fingers tapping a silent rhythm. Dr. Hay, his notebook closed, murmured to Lady Beatrice, who nodded absently, her lavender dress creased from pacing. Inspector Craddock, his interviews complete, conferred with his constable near the door, their voices low but urgent. Miss Marple resumed her seat, her knitting bag at her side, and picked up her needles, the soft click a steady anchor. The sugar bowl's askew lid nagged at her, a small imperfection that spoke of intent. The untouched second teacup, cooling on the table, raised another question. Was Evelyn the sole target, or had the poisoner cast a wider net? The tea table's open placement made it a bold choice for murder, its accessibility both a strength and a risk. She recalled the guests' movements, Colonel Bantry's booming tales, Clara's flitting critiques, Dr. Hay's hovering presence, and Leonard Gray's fleeting shadow at the garden's edge. Craddock, noticing her quiet presence, approached. Miss Marple, you've been here all afternoon. Anything you've noticed? His tone was polite but skeptical, as if an elderly spinster's observations were mere gossip. She smiled, her eyes crinkling. Just small things, Inspector. The sugar bowl's lid was a bit off, as if replaced in haste, and that second teacup, that it wasn't touched. Her words were vague, planting seeds without revealing her hand. Craddock jotted a note, his attention already shifting to his constable's report. Miss Marple's thoughts returned to the kitchen, where Mrs. Benton's account had been clear but not airtight. The sugar bowl, filled that morning, had passed through several hands before reaching the table. Mary, who had served the tea, was a link in the chain, her nervousness suggesting more than simple shock. Miss Marple considered Leonard Gray, whose absence from the drawing-room was as conspicuous as his earlier presence. His bitter words, overheard by Mary, painted him as a man scorned. But the sugar bowl's accessibility widened the net of suspicion. Clara Voss's resentment, Colonel Bantry's debts, Dr. Hay's quick diagnosis siege was a thread in the tapestry. Determined to explore further, Miss Marple sought out Mary again, finding her in the pantry, sorting linens with a distracted air. "Mary, dear," she said softly, "you've had a trying day. I won't keep you, but I wonder if you saw anyone near the tea table before the party began." Mary's hands stilled, her eyes wary. I'm not sure, Miss. It was busy, with servants coming and going. But I did see Mr. Gray near the garden gate early this morning, before the guests arrived. He looked out of sorts, like he was waiting for someone. She hesitated, then added, "I didn't think to mention it before. It didn't seem important." Miss Marple nodded, her face kind but her mind alert. "You've done well, Mary. Even small things can matter." She let the girl return to her work, her thoughts turning to Leonard's early presence. Had he lingered to tamper with the sugar bowl, or was his purpose less sinister? The kitchen's bustle offered cover, but also risk any servant might have seen him. She considered the spare sugar bowl, its lid askew like its twin. Was it a careless habit, or a sign of tampering repeated across the household's silver? Back in the drawing-room, the guests' tension had thickened, their whispers sharp with accusation. Colonel Bantry, pacing now, muttered about the damned inconvenience of their detention. Clara Voss, her book abandoned, lit another cigarette, her eyes narrowing as she watched Lady Beatrice. Dr. Hay, his hands still, stared at the floor, his earlier agitation replaced by a quiet unease. Miss Marple, resuming her knitting, noted their behaviours, Colonel Bantry's restless energy, Clara's calculated poise, Dr. Hay's sudden stillness. Each was a study in contrasts, their public faces at odds with private thoughts. She approached Lady Beatrice, who stood near a portrait of her late husband, her handkerchief twisted in her hands. "This must be a terrible burden, Lady Beatrice," Miss Marple said gently. "Did Evelyn have any enemies, perhaps? Someone who might have wished her harm?" Lady Beatrice's eyes flickered, a shadow of doubt crossing her face. Enemies, no, she was beloved. But she was troubled lately. Her engagement to Mr. Tate was sudden, and not everyone approved. Leonard Gray, in particular, he was devoted. To her, her voice was soft, as if reluctant to speak ill of the living. Miss Marple nodded, her needles clicking steadily. "Love can be a complicated thing," she said, her tone neutral, but her mind cataloguing the hint of disapproval in Lady Beatrice's words. Was it Leonard's rejection that drove him to act, or was another's resentment? Perhaps Clara's, stung by Evelyn's mockery, more potent. The sugar bowl's secret lay in its ordinariness, a mundane object turned deadly by a careful hand. She considered the second teacup, its presence a puzzle. Had it been meant for another, or was it a decoy to obscure the target? Craddock reinterred, his face weary but resolute. "The samples are off to the lab," he announced. "We'll know soon if the poison was in the sugar or the tea. Until then, no one leaves." His voice was firm, but Miss Marple sensed his frustration. The alibis were too fluid, the scene too open. She caught his eye, offering a small nod, but held back Mary's latest revelation. The inspector needed evidence, not whispers, and she needed more to tie Leonard or anyone to the act. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the manor's routine, the small moments that went unnoticed. Mrs. Benton's pride in her tea blend ruled out tampering there, but the sugar bowl's journey from pantry to table offered opportunities. Had Leonard or another slipped into the kitchen unnoticed? Or had the poison been placed earlier, perhaps in the pantry itself? She recalled a case in St. Mary Mead, where a poisoned jar of jam had sat innocently on a shelf, its danger hidden, until consumed. The parallel was striking, though the scale here was grander, the stakes higher. As the evening deepened, the drawing-room grew oppressive, the guests' murmurs, a low hum of fear and suspicion. Miss Marple slipped out again, this time to the garden, where the constable stood guard. The tea-table, now bare, seemed a ghost of its former elegance. She paused by the trellis where Evelyn had fallen, and noticed a faint scuff in the grass, as if someone had stood there briefly. It was a small thing, but Miss Marple knew small things could unravel great mysteries. Had Leonard lingered here, or was another guest Clara, Colonel Bantry, Dr. Haken sealing their movements? Returning to the drawing-room, she resumed her knitting, the lavender scarf growing under her fingers. The guests, unaware of her scrutiny, continued their uneasy vigil. Clara's sharp glances, Colonel Bantry's pacing, Dr. Hayes' stillness, each was a piece of the puzzle. The sugar bowl's secret was the key, its askew lid a silent accusation. Miss Marple knew the truth lay in the ordinary: a spoonful of sugar, a misplaced lid, a whispered threat. As the fire's embers faded, she felt the threads of the mystery tightening, ready to be woven into clarity. Chapter 7. Motives and Masks. The drawing-room of Rosewood Manor. Once a haven of polished elegance, now felt like a stage where each guest played a carefully curated role. The fire had dwindled to a faint glow, its embers casting flickering shadows. Across the ornate wallpaper, the tall windows, framing the darkened rose garden beyond, reflected the room's occupants, a collection of strained faces, each masking thoughts too dangerous to voice. The air was heavy with the weight of suspicion. The earlier civility of the garden party replaced by a restless unease that seemed to pulse with every tick of the mantel clock. Inspector Craddock's investigation had confined the guests, and their patience, like the fire, was burning low. Miss Jane Marple sat in her corner near the fireplace, her lavender knitting folded neatly in her lap, her spectacles glinting as she observed the room. To the untrained eye, she was merely a frail spinster, her white hair pinned with precision, her hands idle but ready to resume their rhythmic task. Yet her mind was far from idle. Weaving together the threads of the afternoon's tragedy, Evelyn Drake's collapse, the almond-like scent of cyanide, the sugar bowl's askew lid, and the whispered confession of Mary, the maid, about Leonard. Gray's bitter words. Each detail was a stitch in a pattern only she could see, and now, as the evening deepened, she turned her attention to the guests. Their motives hidden behind masks of propriety. Colonel Reginald Bantry stood by a bookcase, his military posture rigid but his hands betraying a nervous energy as they adjusted his cufflinks. His ruddy face, usually animated with tales of colonial exploits, was set in a scowl, his mustache twitching as he muttered to himself. Miss Marple recalled village gossip about a debt he owed to Evelyn's late father, a matter of honour that had lingered unresolved. The Colonel's calm exterior at the party had struck her as forced, a performance to deflect attention. Was his restlessness now a sign of guilt, or merely the frustration of a man unaccustomed to confinement? She noted his occasional glances toward the garden, where Evelyn's body lay under its sheet, and wondered what memories those glances stirred. Clara Voss, seated on a velvet sofa, had abandoned her book and cigarettes, her burgundy-suited figure striking against the pale cushions. Her green eyes, sharp as cut glass, roamed the room, lingering on Lady Beatrice, then Dr. Hay, before settling briefly on Miss Marple herself. Clara's quick aversion of gaze suggested she sensed the old woman's scrutiny, though she masked it with a tight smile. Miss Marple knew of Clara's feud with Evelyn, sparked by the young woman's public dismissal of her novels as vapid sensationalism. The barb had stung, Miss Marple suspected, not just for its cruelty, but for its truth. Clara's work thrived on real-life grudges, thinly veiled as fiction. Could such a slight have driven her to murder, or was her sharp tongue merely a shield for deeper fears? Dr. Percival Hayes sat in a high-backed chair, his thin frame hunched, his spectacles slipping down his nose. His hands, no longer tapping nervously, rested limply on his closed notebook, as if he had exhausted his reserves of energy. His swift identification of cyanide had impressed Miss Marple, but it also raised questions. As the village physician, he had access to chemicals, though cyanide was not a staple of his dispensary. His treatment of Evelyn for nerves suggested a familiarity with her private struggles. Had she confided in him about her engagement, her fears, or perhaps Leonard Gray's rejection? His quiet demeanour now, so different from his earlier agitation, hinted at a man wrestling with his own secrets. Lady Beatrice Harrow, her lavender dress now wilted like the roses outside, moved among the guests with a hostess's instinct, though her smiles were strained. She paused to offer water to a young couple, her hands trembling as she poured. Miss Marple, watching from her corner, noted the way Lady Beatrice avoided looking at the garden windows, as if the sight of Evelyn's covered form was too much to bear. Her earlier insistence that no one at her party could commit such an act had rung hollow, and now her restless movements suggested a mind burdened by doubt. Did she know more about Evelyn's troubles than she admitted, or was her distress simply that of a grieving aunt? Miss Marple's thoughts returned to the sugar bowl. Its askew lit a silent clue to the poisoner's hand. The kitchen visit had confirmed its role as the likely vehicle for the cyanide, its granules the perfect disguise for a deadly dose. The untouched second teacup, cooling on the table, added another layer to the mystery. Had it been meant for another, or was it a deliberate misdirection? The open nature of the tea table made it a bold choice for murder, but its accessibility was its genius. Anyone could have approached it unnoticed. Colonel Bantry, pausing between stories, Clara, flitting through the crowd, Dr. Hay, lingering near Lady Beatrice, or Leonard Gray, whose absence now was as telling as his earlier presence. The clock struck 7, its chimes cutting through the room's murmurs. Inspector Craddock, his face lined with fatigue, reinterred from the study, his constable trailing behind. "We're awaiting the lab results," he announced, his voice firm but weary. "Until then, I need everyone to remain here. If anyone recalls anything, any detail, however small, speak now." His eyes swept the room, lingering on Colonel Bantry, who looked away, and Clara, who met his gaze with a defiant tilt of her chin. Miss Marple, her knitting untouched, offered a small nod, but she held back her thoughts. The inspector, she knew, relied on evidence, while she trusted the subtler language of human behavior. Determined to probe further, Miss Marple rose, her movements slow but deliberate, and approached Dr. Hay. "A dreadful day, Doctor," she said, her voice gentle. "You did all you could for poor Evelyn. It must be difficult, knowing her as you did." Dr. Hay started, his spectacles slipping further. Yes, it's a shock," he stammered. "I treated her for nerves, you know. She was anxious about her engagement, but she never spoke of danger." His words were careful, but Miss Marple noted the way his hands tightened, as if guarding a truth. "Anxiety can mask many things," she said, her tone neutral. "Did she ever mention Mr. Gray, perhaps?" Dr. Hay shook his head too quickly and returned to his chair, his silence louder than words. Next, Miss Marple approached Clara Voss, who was now standing by the fireplace, her fingers tracing the edge of a porcelain figurine. "Your novels must give you such insight into people, Miss Voss," Miss Marple said, her smile disarming. "You must see through masks better than most." Clara's eyes narrowed, but she laughed, a sharp sound. "People are predictable, Miss Marple. Were their motives like cheap perfume? Evelyn, though she thought herself above it all, didn't she?" Her tone was bitter, and Miss Marple noted the edge, a resentment that went beyond professional rivalry. "Pride can be dangerous," Miss Marple agreed, her eyes meeting Clara's, "but so can envy." Clara flinched, her mask slipping for a moment, before she turned away, muttering about needing air. Colonel Bantry was her next target, still by the bookcase, his hands now clasped tightly behind him. "Colonel, you've seen so much of the world," Miss Marple said, her voice warm with admiration. "This must seem so petty compared to your adventures," he grunted, his moustache twitching. "Petty? Murder's never petty, Miss Marple, but I'll be damned if I know who'd do this. Evelyn was a fine girl, though her father was a hard man. Owed him a bit, you know, from years back. Nothing serious." His words were casual, but his eyes avoided hers, and Miss Marple sensed a weight behind his dismissal. A debt, even an old one, could fester, especially for a man of honour. Lady Beatrice, catching Miss Marple's eye, approached, her handkerchief now a crumpled knot. "Miss Marple, you're so calm," she said, her voice breaking. "How do you bear it? Evelyn was my hope for the future." Miss Marple patted her hand, her touch gentle but her mind alert. "Loss is hard, Lady Beatrice, but sometimes we see more clearly through grief. Did Evelyn seem happy with Mr. Tate?" Lady Beatrice hesitated, her eyes flickering. She was determined. "Roland is a good match, but Leonard Gray was so devoted. I thought she might reconsider." Her words trailed off, and Miss Marple noted the hint of regret, as if Lady Beatrice had favoured the artist over the industrialist. Returning to her seat, Miss Marple resumed her knitting, the soft click of her needles a counterpoint to the room's tension. The guests' masks, Colonel Bantry's stoicism, Clara's defiance, Dr. Hay's reticence, Lady Beatrice's grief were slipping, revealing glimpses of their true selves. She thought of Leonard Gray, still absent, his bitter words a shadow. Over the case, Mary's confession had pointed to him, but the sugar bowl's accessibility widened the net. The second teacup, untouched, nagged at her. Was it a mistake, or a deliberate act to confuse? The cyanide, swift and subtle, required a mind both bold and precise. And Miss Marple knew such a mind was in this room, hiding behind a mask of propriety. His patience thinning, called for another round of questions, his voice sharp with frustration. He summoned Colonel Bantry first, who strode to the study with a soldier's resolve. Miss Marple watched, noting the colonel's squared shoulders as if bracing for battle. Clara, left alone, lit another cigarette, her eyes darting to the door. Dr. Hay, his hands now steady, reopened his notebook, though he wrote nothing. Lady Beatrice, pacing again, paused by the garden windows, her face a study in anguish. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to St. Mary Mead, where a stolen letter had once revealed a murderer's heart. The motives here were more complex: envy, debt, pride, but the pattern was the same. The sugar bowl, with its askew lid, was the key, its secret hidden in plain sight. Had Leonard tampered with it, driven by rejection? Or had Clara, stung by Evelyn's scorn, sought revenge? Was Colonel Bantry's debt a motive, or Dr. Hay's knowledge of cyanide a clue to his involvement? The truth, Miss Marple knew, lay in the small things: the glance, the pause, the mask that slipped. As the clock struck 8, the room grew colder, the fire's embers barely holding back the night. The guests, their masks fraying, waited for answers, but Miss Marple knew patience was her ally. She knitted on her needles, a quiet rhythm, her mind weaving a net to catch a killer. The sugar bowl's secret would not remain hidden for long, not when she saw the patterns others missed. Chapter 8. The spurned lovers' trail. The night had draped Rosewood Manor in a heavy cloak of shadow. The rose garden beyond the windows now a dark silhouette against the moonlit sky. Inside, the drawing-room's atmosphere was thick with unspoken accusations, the guests' earlier civility worn thin by hours of confinement. The fire had died to a faint glow, its embers casting a feeble light across the polished furniture where reflections of tense faces flickered like ghosts. The mantel clock ticked relentlessly, its chimes marking the slow passage of time as Inspector Craddock's investigation held everyone in its grip. The tragedy of Evelyn Drake's death, marked by the bitter scent of cyanide and the shattered teacup, hung over the room, a silent accusation that no one could escape. Miss Jane Marple sat in her corner by the fireplace, her lavender knitting folded neatly in her lap, her spectacles catching the dim light as she observed the scene. Her white hair, pinned with precision, and her gentle demeanor made her seem an inconsequential figure, easily overlooked amid the drama. Yet her mind was a whirl of activity, piecing together the fragments of the day, the sugar bowls askew, lid, the untouched second teacup, Mary's whispered tale of Leonard Gray's bitter words, and the subtle shifts in the guests' behavior, Colonel Bantry's restless pacing, Clara Voss's sharp glances, Dr. Hay's uneasy stillness, and Lady Beatrice's strained composure. Each was a thread in a tapestry of motive and opportunity, and Miss Marple was determined to follow the trail that led to the truth. The absence of Leonard Gray, the spurned suitor, was a glaring gap in the room's assembly. His fleeting presence at the garden's edge during the party, coupled with Mary's account of his angry exchange with Evelyn the previous night, made him a figure of keen interest. Miss Marple, her thoughts as precise as her knitting stitches, knew that love scorned could twist into vengeance, but she also knew the danger of assuming too much too soon. The sugar bowl, the likely vehicle for the cyanide, had been accessible to all, and other motives in view. Debt, hidden fears, lurked beneath the guests' polished exteriors. Yet Leonard's absence demanded exploration, and Miss Marple resolved to pursue it. She approached Inspector Craddock, who stood near the drawing-room door, his notebook filled with contradictory alibis and vague recollections. His face was etched with fatigue, his earlier confidence tempered by the case's complexity. "Inspector," Miss Marple said, her voice soft but clear, "I couldn't help but notice that Mr. Leonard Gray isn't among us. He was at the party briefly, wasn't he? Perhaps he might shed light on poor Evelyn's last moments." Her tone was deferential, but her eyes were sharp, planting a seed she knew Craddock would act upon. He frowned, flipping through his notes. "Gray, you say? No one mentioned him leaving. I'll have the constable check his whereabouts." He nodded to his assistant, who hurried out, and Miss Marple returned to her seat, satisfied that the trail would be followed. The idea of visiting Leonard Gray's cottage took root, and Miss Marple, with her knack for gentle persuasion, convinced Craddock to allow her to accompany him. "I know the village paths, Inspector," she said, her smile disarming, "and I shan't be in the way." Craddock, though skeptical, agreed, perhaps sensing that her unassuming presence might loosen tongues. They set out in the constable's car, the night air cool and sharp as they drove through the winding lanes of St. Mary Mead. The cottage, a modest stone structure on the village's outskirts, was dark, its windows unlit, but a faint glow from within suggested occupancy. Craddock knocked firmly, and after a moment the door creaked open to reveal Leonard Gray, his dark hair dishevelled, his eyes shadowed with fatigue. He wore a paint-stained smock over a rumpled shirt, and the scent of turpentine mingled with something sharper, almost medicinal. "Inspector," he said, his voice low and wary, "what's this about?" His gaze flicked to Miss Marple, lingering briefly before returning to Craddock. The inspector, wasting no time, explained the tragedy at Rosewood Manor, watching Leonard's reaction closely. The artist's face paled, his hands clenching at his sides, but he said nothing, only stepping aside to let them in. The cottage was a study in controlled chaos. Canvases leaned against walls, their bold strokes depicting stormy landscapes and brooding figures. A table held brushes, paints, and a small vial labelled bitter almond extract. Its scent eerily reminiscent of the cyanide that had killed Evelyn. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed, though her expression remained mild. "You're quite the artist, Mr. Gray," she said, her voice warm. "This extract used for your paintings, I presume?" Leonard nodded, his jaw tight. "It's for mixing colours, gives a certain depth, nothing more." His words were clipped, defensive, and Miss Marple noted the tremble in his hands as he gestured to a canvas. Craddock, less subtle, pointed to the vial. "This smells like what we found in Miss Drake's teacup. Care to explain?" Leonard's eyes widened, but he shook his head. "I loved Evelyn. I'd never harm her. Yes, I was angry she chose Tate over me, after everything we'd shared. But poison, that's madness." His voice broke, and Miss Marple, watching closely, saw genuine grief in his eyes, though it was tempered by something else, fear perhaps, or guilt. She glanced at a waste-bin near the table, where a torn letter lay among crumpled sketches. Its edges bore the faint script of a hurried hand, and she made a mental note to examine it later. Craddock pressed further, asking about Leonard's presence at the party. "I was there briefly," Leonard admitted. "I wanted to see her, too, to understand why she'd changed. But I couldn't stay. It was too much." His words were vague, and Miss Marple sensed he was holding back. Had he lingered near the tea table, perhaps tampering with the sugar bowl? Or was his absence a coincidence, his grief genuine? She thought of St. Mary Mead, where a rejected suitor had once sabotaged a rival's garden, a petty act born of the same passion that might drive a man to murder. As Craddock continued his questions, Miss Marple wandered to the waste-bin, her movements slow and unobtrusive. She bent as if to adjust her shawl, her fingers brushing the torn letter. The fragments were few, but words stood out, sweeten her fate and final act. Her heart quickened, though her face remained serene. The letter, if pieced together, might reveal intent, but she left it untouched, knowing Craddock would need to collect it as evidence. She straightened, her eyes meeting Leonard's for a moment. His gaze was wary, as if he sensed her scrutiny, and she smiled, disarming him with her apparent harmlessness. Returning to Craddock's side, she said nothing of the letter, letting the inspector pursue his line of inquiry. Leonard's denials grew more vehement, his hands gesturing wildly as he insisted he'd never harm Evelyn. "I loved her," he repeated, his voice cracking. "She was everything to me." Miss Marple, listening quietly, thought of the sugar bowl, its granules the perfect disguise for cyanide. Had Leonard, in a moment of despair, acted on his bitter words? Or was he, like the others, wearing a mask that concealed a different truth? The visit ended with Craddock instructing Leonard to remain available for further questioning. As they left the cottage, Miss Marple's mind was abuzz with possibilities. The vial of almond extract, the torn letter, Leonard's absence from the drawing-room all pointed to him, yet the sugar bowl's accessibility kept other suspects in play. Clara Voss's resentment, Colonel Bantry's debt, Dr. Hay's knowledge of cyanide etch was a thread in the mystery, and Miss Marple knew better than to tug only one. Back at Rosewood Manor, the drawing-room was quieter now, the guests, energy sapped by the long wait. Colonel Bantry sat heavily, his hands still, his eyes fixed on the floor. Clara Voss, her cigarette case empty, toyed with a strand of her dark hair, her sharp wit subdued. Dr. Hay, his notebook open again, scribbled absently, his face a mask of concentration. Lady Beatrice, standing by the windows, stared into the dark garden, her handkerchief a crumpled relic of her grief. Miss Marple resumed her seat, her knitting untouched, her thoughts on the letter's fragments. Sweeten her fate was a chilling phrase, suggesting a deliberate act, but was it Leonard's hand that had acted, or another's? Craddock, returning with Miss Marple, addressed the guests. "We've spoken to Mr. Gray," he said, his voice steady. "He claims no involvement, but will follow every lead. The lab results should tell us more about the poison's source." His words were met with murmurs, some relieved, others skeptical. Miss Marple, listening, noted Clara's quick glance at the mention of Leonard's name, and Dr. Hay's subtle flinch. Colonel Bantry, however, remained impassive, his silence as telling as his earlier bluster. Miss Marple's thoughts returned to the sugar bowl. Its askew lit a beacon in her mind. The kitchen's routine, as described by Mrs. Benton, offered a narrow window for tampering, but the manor's bustle provided cover. Had Leonard slipped in unnoticed, or had another guest Clara, perhaps, or even Dr. Hay seized the opportunity? The second teacup, untouched, nagged at her. Was it a mistake or a calculated act to obscure the target? She recalled a case in St. Mary Mead, where a poisoned cake had been meant for one but taken by another, the randomness of the act masking its intent. The parallel was striking, though the elegance of Rosewood Manor made this crime feel more calculated. As the clock struck 9, the room grew colder, the guests' masks slipping further. Clara's sharp eyes softened with fatigue. Colonel Bantry's shoulders slumped. Dr. Hay's scribbling slowed, and Lady Beatrice's pacing ceased. Miss Marple, her knitting still in her lap, felt the threads of the mystery tightening. The spurned lover's trail led to Leonard Gray, but the sugar bowl's secret was shared by others. She would watch and listen and wait, knowing the truth lay in the small things: a torn letter, a misplaced lid, a glance that lingered too long. Chapter 9. The Garden's Hidden Corners. The night had settled heavily over Rosewood Manor, its darkness seeping into the rose garden, where the vibrant blooms now seemed to mourn in silence. The cordoned-off tea table, stripped of its silver and porcelain, stood as a ghostly relic under the moonlight, the white cloth flapping like a surrendered flag. Evelyn Drake's body, still beneath its sheet, lay near the trellis. The roses sent a faint echo of the afternoon's gaiety. The manor's drawing room, where the guests remained confined, buzzed with a low hum of exhaustion and suspicion. But Miss Jane Marple sought the solitude of the garden, where the air was cooler and her thoughts could unfurl without interruption. Her grey shawl draped over her shoulders, Miss Marple moved with the careful steps of an elderly woman, though her eyes, sharp behind her spectacles, missed nothing. The garden, so open and inviting during the party, now held a secretive air, its paths and corners cloaked in shadow. Her knitting bag hung from her arm, a prop that lent her an air of harmlessness, but her mind was as keen as a needle, stitching together the day's clues. The sugar bowl's askew lid, the untouched second teacup, Mary's whispered tale of Leonard Gray's anger, and the torn letter in his cottage, its fragments hinting at a sinister intent. The visit to Leonard had sharpened her suspicions, but the sugar bowl's accessibility kept other possibilities alive: Clara Voss's resentment, Colonel Bantry's debts, Dr. Hayes' uneasy knowledge. Miss Marple's purpose in the garden was deliberate. She had slipped away from the drawing room, where Inspector Craddock's ongoing interviews had left the guests restless, to explore the scene of the crime in solitude. The police had secured the tea table, but the garden's hidden corners, benches tucked behind hedges, paths winding through rosebeds, might hold clues overlooked in the initial chaos. She moved toward a secluded bench near a yew hedge, where the grass was soft and the roses grew thick, their thorns glinting in the moonlight. Here, she reasoned, someone could have lingered unnoticed, watching the tea table or perhaps tampering with it as she approached. Her eyes caught a faint irregularity in the grasser-crushed sugar cube, its granules sparkling unnaturally under the moon's glow. She knelt, her shawl brushing the ground, and examined it without touching, knowing the police would need to collect it. The cube's edges were uneven, as if stepped on, and its texture seemed denser than ordinary sugar, a subtle difference that might mean nothing or everything. Miss Marple's mind flashed to the sugar bowl, its lid askew, and the possibility that the cyanide had been mixed into the granules, ready to dissolve in Evelyn's tea. Had this cube been dropped in haste, a careless slip by the poisoner, or was it a deliberate plant meant to mislead? She straightened, her thoughts racing. The bench, half hidden by the yew, offered a clear view of the tea table, yet its seclusion made it a perfect vantage point for someone wishing to remain unseen. She recalled Leonard Gray's fleeting presence at the garden's edge, his dark coat a shadow among the pastel crowd. Mary's account of seeing him near the garden gate that morning added weight to his involvement, but the sugar bowl's open placement meant others: Clara, Colonel Bantry, Dr. Hay had equal opportunity. The crushed cube was a new thread, one she would weave into the pattern later. Miss Marple moved deeper into the garden, her steps slow but purposeful, following a narrow path that wound past a fountain and into a cluster of rose bushes. The air was heavy with their scent, a reminder of the afternoon's lost innocence. She paused by a low stone wall where the roses grew wilder, their petals scattered on the ground. Here she noticed another small detail, faint scuff in the earth, as if someone had stood for a time, perhaps watching or waiting. The mark was fresh, the soil disturbed, and Miss Marple's mind turned to the party's early moments, when the guests had mingled freely, their movements untracked. Seeking further insight, she sought out the gardener, Mr. Dobbs, a wiry man with hands roughened by years of tending the manor's blooms. She found him near the greenhouse, pruning shears in hand, his face etched with the day's strain. "A terrible thing, Mr. Dobbs," she said, her voice gentle, her smile inviting trust. "You must know this garden better than anyone did. You see anything unusual today, perhaps before the party began?" Dobbs, wiping his brow, hesitated, then nodded. "I did, miss. Early this morning, before the guests came, I saw Mr. Gray by the tea table. He was just standing there, looking at it like he was waiting for something. Didn't think much of it then, but now." His voice trailed off, and Miss Marple's eyes sharpened, though her expression remained kind. "Thank you, Mr. Dobbs," she said. "You've been most helpful." She turned back toward the manor, her mind weaving the gardener's words into the tapestry. Leonard's presence at the tea table, hours before the party, suggested opportunity, if not intent. The crushed sugar cube, the scuff in the earth, the torn letters, chilling phrases all pointed to him, yet Miss Marple knew better than to trust a single thread. In St. Mary Mead, she had once unravelled a theft by noticing the misplaced flower pot, a small clue that led to a larger truth. The garden's hidden corners were speaking, and she was listening. Back in the drawing room, the guests' tension had thickened, their masks of civility fraying under the weight of confinement. Colonel Bantry, no longer pacing, sat heavily, his hands clasped, his eyes fixed on a portrait of Lady Beatrice's late husband. Clara Voss, her sharp wit dulled by fatigue, toyed with a strand of her dark hair, her green eyes scanning the room with less defiance than before. Dr. Hay, his notebook abandoned, sat with his hands folded, his spectacles reflecting the dim firelight. Lady Beatrice, her lavender dress now creased beyond repair, stood by the windows, her face a study in quiet despair. Miss Marple resumed her seat, her knitting bag at her side, but she did not knit. Her thoughts were on the garden, the crushed cube, the scuff, the bench's secluded view. The sugar bowl, she was certain, was the key, its granules laced with cyanide in a bold, calculated act. Leonard Gray's trail was clear, but the garden's open nature meant others could have acted unnoticed. Clara's resentment, sparked by Evelyn's mockery, was a motive as sharp as her pen. Colonel Bantry's debt, a shadow from the past, might have driven him to desperation. Dr. Hay's knowledge of cyanide, coupled with his nervous demeanour, suggested a deeper involvement. Even Lady Beatrice, grieving yet guarded, might know more than she revealed. Inspector Craddock, his face lined with exhaustion, re-entered the room, his constable trailing with a sheaf of notes. "We've searched Mr. Gray's cottage," he announced, his voice steady but strained. "Found a vial of almond extract, which we're testing, and some torn papers. We'll piece them together, but it's too early to say more." His eyes swept the room, lingering on Clara, who looked away, and Dr. Hay, who adjusted his spectacles nervously. Miss Marple, listening, noted the absence of any mention of the sugar cube or the garden's scuff-marks details Craddock had yet to uncover. She considered sharing her findings, but held back, knowing the inspector preferred tangible evidence to an old woman's observations. Instead, she approached Lady Beatrice, who stood alone, her handkerchief a crumpled knot. "This garden is so lovely," Miss Marple said, her tone conversational. "It must hold many secrets, with all its hidden corners." Lady Beatrice's eyes flickered, a shadow crossing her face. "It's always been a place of beauty," she said softly, "but now it feels tainted." Her words were vague, but Miss Marple sensed a weight behind them, as if the garden held memories she could not share. Returning to her seat, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the second teacup, its untouched contents a puzzle. Had it been meant for another, or was it a decoy to mask the poisonous intent? The sugar bowl's accessibility made it a perfect weapon, but also a risky one. Any guest might have taken the fatal dose. She recalled a case in St. Mary Mead, where a poisoned bottle of sherry had been left in a vicarage, its randomness a deliberate ploy to obscure the target. The parallel was striking, though the elegance of Rosewood Manor lent this crime a chilling precision. The clock struck 10. Its chimes a somber reminder of the night's passage. The guests, their energy sapped, sat in near silence, their earlier murmurs replaced by a heavy stillness. Colonel Bantry's hands were still, Clara's eyes half closed, Dr. Hay's face unreadable, Lady Beatrice's posture defeated. Miss Marple, her knitting untouched, felt the threads of the mystery tightening. The garden's hidden corners, the crushed cube, the scuff, the bench were speaking, and Leonard Gray's trail was growing clearer. Yet she knew the truth was not his alone. The sugar bowl's secret was shared, its poison a reflection of a heart turned cold by love, envy, or debt. As the fire's last embers faded, Miss Marple's mind remained alight, weaving the gardens clues into a pattern. The truth, she knew, lay in the small things: a crushed cube, a scuff in the earth, a lover's bitter words. She would wait and watch and listen, knowing the garden's hidden corners would yield their secrets in time. Chapter 10. The Confrontation. The library of Rosewood Manor, with its towering bookshelves and leather-bound volumes, was a haven of somber dignity, its oak-panelled walls absorbing the tension that had spilled over from the drawing-room. The fire, in the great cast, a warm, flickering light, but it did little to dispel the chill that had settled over the guests, now gathered at Inspector Craddock's command. The night outside pressed against the tall windows, the rose garden a dark void, where Evelyn Drake's body still lay, a silent accusation beneath its white sheet. The clock on the mantel struck 11, its chimes sharp and deliberate, as if marking the moment for truth to step into the light. Miss Jane Marple sat near the back of the room, her grey shawl draped neatly over her shoulders, her lavender knitting folded in her lap. Her spectacles glinted faintly, her mild demeanour masking the keen mind that had been weaving together the day's clues. The sugar bowl's askew lid, the crushed sugar cube in the garden, the untouched second teacup, Mary's whispered tale of Leonard Gray's anger, and the torn letter in his cottage, its fragments hinting at a chilling plan. The garden's hidden corners had spoken to her, and now, as the guests faced Craddock's scrutiny, she sensed the threads of the mystery drawing tight, ready to reveal the pattern of murder. Inspector Craddock stood at the centre of the room, his notebook closed, his face set with a determination tempered by fatigue. The guests, their earlier restlessness subdued, sat in a semicircle of her backed chairs, their faces a gallery of unease. Colonel Bantry, his military bearing strained, gripped the arms of his chair, his moustache no longer twitching with bluster. Clara Voss, her burgundy suit creased, sat with her hands folded, her green eyes wary but defiant. Dr. Percival Hay, his spectacles polished to a shine, held his notebook like a shield, his thin frame tense. Lady Beatrice Harrow, her lavender dress wilted, stood near a bookcase, her face pale but composed, as if steeling herself for what was to come. Leonard Gray, summoned from his cottage, stood at the edge of the group, his dark eyes haunted, his hands clenched at his sides, cleared his throat, his voice steady but carrying an edge of authority. "We've been here for hours, and the lab results are still pending, but we've gathered enough to narrow our focus. Miss Drake's death was no accident. Cyanide in her tea, likely from the sugar bowl, points to deliberate intent. I've asked you all here to go over the facts, and I expect honesty." His eyes swept the room, lingering on Leonard, who shifted uncomfortably. Miss Marple, her knitting untouched, watched the reactions. Colonel Bantry's tightened grip, Clara's subtle flinch, Dr. Hay's quick glance downward, Lady Beatrice's rigid posture. She rose, her movements slow but deliberate, and addressed Craddock with a gentle smile. "Inspector, if I may, I've been thinking about the sugar bowl. It's such a small thing, but it seems central, doesn't it? And those little details, the lid not quite right, the cube in the garden well, they do tell a story." Her voice was soft, almost apologetic, but her eyes were sharp, and Craddock, though accustomed to dismissing her, nodded. "Go on, Miss Marple. What's your point?" The guests turned, their expressions a mix of curiosity and unease, as if sensing the old woman's words carried weight. Miss Marple clasped her hands, her shawl slipping slightly. It began with the tea table, so open and inviting, yet so dangerous. The sugar bowl, I believe, was tampered with cyanide mixed into the granules, dissolving perfectly in Miss Drake's tea. The almond-like smell confirmed it. As Dr. Hay so astutely noted, she nodded toward the physician, who adjusted his spectacles, his face pulling. But the bowl was accessible to all, and the question is, who had motive and opportunity? I couldn't help but recall what Mary, the maid, overheard last night, a conversation in the library, quite heated, between Miss Drake and Mr. Gray. Leonard's head snapped up, his eyes blazing. "That's no secret. I was upset. Yes, she'd thrown me over for Tate, after all we'd been through. But I didn't kill her." His voice cracked, and Miss Marple's expression remained serene, though her mind noted his desperation. "Of course, Mr. Gray," she said gently, "but you were seen near the tea table this morning, before the party, by Mr. Dobbs, the gardener, and in your cottage there was a vial of almond extract, curiously similar to the scent of cyanide." The room stirred, murmurs rippling through the guests. Craddock's eyes narrowed, his hand tightening on his notebook. "Is that true, Gray? You were at the table?" Leonard's jaw clenched, his hands trembling. I was there, yes, but only to see the setup. I wanted to know if she'd be there, if I could talk to her. I didn't touch anything." His words were fervent, but Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the waste-bin in his cottage, where the torn letter lay. "And then," she continued, her voice steady, "there was the letter in your cottage, Mr. Gray, torn but readable. Phrases like 'sweeten her fate' and 'final act,' they do suggest a certain intent, don't they?" The room fell silent, the guest's eyes fixed on Leonard, whose face drained of colour. Colonel Bantry coughed, Clara's hands tightened. Dr. Hay's notebook slipped to the floor, and Lady Beatrice gasped softly. Craddock stepped forward, his voice sharp. "Gray, you'd better explain this letter. now." Leonard's hands rose, as if to ward off the accusation. "It wasn't what you think. I wrote it in anger, yes, after she rejected me. I was hurt. I wanted her to feel something, regret, maybe, but not death. I tore it up because it was foolish, not because I acted on it." His voice broke, and Miss Marple, watching closely, saw tears in his eyes, though she also noted the tremor in his hands, a sign of more than grief. She turned to the group, her tone calm but firm. "The sugar bowl was the key, I think. Someone replaced its contents with cyanide-laced granules, knowing Miss Drake's habit of sweetening her tea. The lid, left askew, suggests haste, and the crushed cube in the garden near that secluded bench hints at a moment of carelessness. Mr. Gray was seen there, but others moved freely too." She paused, her eyes sweeping the room. "Miss Voss, you were quick to call it poison, weren't you? And your dislike for Miss Drake was no secret, after her remarks about your work." Clara's eyes flashed, her voice sharp. "Are you accusing me, Miss Marple?" "Yes, Evelyn was cruel about my novels, but I don't stoop to murder over a slight. I saw her fall, like everyone else." Her defiance was convincing, but Miss Marple noted the way her fingers twisted a ring, a nervous tick that betrayed her. "Composure, and Colonel Bantry," Miss Marple continued, her voice gentle but unrelenting. "You spoke of a debt to Miss Drake's father. Such things can weigh heavily, can't they?" The Colonel's face reddened, his voice a growl. "That debt was old history, settled years ago. I had no quarrel with the girl. This is preposterous." His bluster was loud, but Miss Marple saw the flicker of unease in his eyes, as if the past were not as settled as he claimed. "Dr. Hay," she said, turning to the physician, "your knowledge of cyanide was remarkably precise, and you treated Miss Drake for nerves. Did she confide anything that might point to danger?" Dr. Hay's spectacles slipped, his hands fumbling to adjust them. She was anxious, yes, about her engagement, but nothing about poison. I only recognized the smell from my training." His voice was thin, and Miss Marple noted the sweat on his brow, a sign of more than professional. Concerned Lady Beatrice, unable to stay silent, stepped forward, her voice trembling. "Miss Marple, please. These are my guests, my friends. Surely you don't think one of us—" Her words faltered, and Miss Marple's smile was kind but firm. "I think, Lady Beatrice, that someone here acted with cold intent. The sugar bowl was bait, set for Miss Drake, and the second teacup and touch suggests either luck or design." Craddock, his patience fraying, turned to Leonard. "Gray, you're the only one with a clear motive and opportunity. That letter, your presence at the table, the almond extract, explain it, or I'll have to take you in." Leonard's shoulders slumped, his voice barely a whisper. I did tamper with the sugar, but not to kill her. I wanted to scare her, to make her think twice about Tate. I used a bitter compound, not cyanide, just enough to make the tea taste odd. I didn't know it would kill her." His confession hung in the air, a mix of anguish and guilt. The room erupted in gasps, Colonel Bantry's voice rising above the rest. "You fool! You played with poison and expected what?" Clara's laugh was sharp, bitter. "A fine artist, but a poor murderer." Dr. Hay's face was ashen, his hands trembling. Lady Beatrice sank into a chair, her handkerchief pressed to her lips. Miss Marple, her eyes steady, spoke softly. "Mr. Gray, you miscalculated. The compound you used must have been contaminated replaced with cyanide. Someone knew your plan and turned it deadly. Craddock, seizing the moment, stepped closer. Who else knew? Grey, speak. Leonard shook his head, tears streaming. No one. I acted alone, I swear. I only meant to frighten her. Miss Marple, her mind racing, considered the possibility. Had another hand swapped the bitter compound for cyanide, using Leonard's plan as a cover? The sugar bowl's accessibility made it plausible, but the precision required pointed to a mind more cunning than Leonard's. She turned to Craddock, her voice calm. Inspector, the torn letter and the crushed cube suggest intent, but the second teacup troubles me. It was untouched, yet placed so close to Miss Drake's. Perhaps someone else knew of Mr. Grey's plan and saw an opportunity. Her words were measured, but they shifted the room's focus. The guests' eyes darting to one another, searching for the betrayer. Craddock nodded, his jaw tight. We'll piece together that letter and test the sugar cube. Grey, you're coming with us for now. As the constable led Leonard away, the room fell silent, the guests' masks shattered by his confession. Miss Marple, her knitting still in her lap, felt the threads of the mystery tightening, but not yet complete. The sugar bowl's secret had been partially revealed, but the hand that turned a prank into murder remained hidden, lurking in the shadows of Rosewood Manor. Chapter 11. The Human Heart, the Library of Rosewood Manor. Its oak-panelled walls and leather-bound tomes, bathed in the soft glow of lamplight, had become a confessional chamber. The fire in the grate crackled faintly, casting fleeting shadows across the faces of the guests, who sat in stunned silence after Leonard Grey's anguished admission. The mantel clock, its steady ticking, a reminder of time's relentless march, struck midnight, its chimes echoing like a solemn knell. The rose garden beyond the tall windows lay shrouded in darkness, its beauty now a mournful backdrop to Evelyn Drake's tragic end. The air was thick with the weight of revelation, yet Miss Jane Marple sensed the mystery was not fully unravelled, its final threads still hidden in the human heart. Miss Marple sat in her corner, her grey shawl neatly draped, her lavender knitting folded in her lap. Her spectacles glinted as she observed the room, her mild demeanour a mask for the keen mind that had pieced together the day's clues. The sugar bowls, askew lid, the crushed sugar cube in the garden, the untouched second teacup, Mary's, whispered tale of Leonard's anger, and the torn letter in his cottage. Its phrases sweeten her fate, final act now explained by his confession. Leonard's claim that he meant only to frighten Evelyn with a bitter compound, not kill her with cyanide, had shifted the puzzle, suggesting another hand had turned his prank deadly. Miss Marple's thoughts, sharp as her knitting needles, probed the motives and masks of those around her, seeking the truth beneath their carefully guarded facades. Inspector Craddock, his face etched with resolve, stood near the fireplace, his notebook tucked away as he addressed the guests. Mr. Grey's confession gives us a starting point, he said, his voice firm but tempered by the late hour. But if he's telling the truth, and will verify that with the lab results, someone else may have tampered with the sugar bowl, turning his plan fatal. I need everyone to think carefully. Did you see anything, anyone, near the tea table before Miss Drake's collapse? His eyes swept the room, lingering on Colonel Bantry, Clara Voss, Dr. Hay, and Lady Beatrice. Harrow, each a study in restrained emotion. Colonel Bantry, his military posture sagging, sat with his hands clasped tightly, his ruddy face pale. His earlier bluster had faded, replaced by a quiet intensity that Miss Marple found telling. Clara Voss, her burgundy suit now rumpled, leaned back in her chair, her green eyes half closed but alert, as if weighing her next words. Dr. Percival. Hay, his spectacles catching the firelight, clutched his notebook, his thin frame rigid with tension. Lady Beatrice, standing by a bookcase, her lavender dress a wilted shadow of its former elegance, pressed a handkerchief to her lips, her eyes red with unshed tears. The guests' silence was heavy, each seemingly reluctant to break it, as if fearing what their words might reveal. Miss Marple, her voice soft but clear, rose to speak, her shawl slipping slightly. Inspector, if I may, the human heart is often at the root of such tragedies. Love, envy, pride, these are powerful forces, and they leave traces, like footprints in a garden. Her words, gentle but deliberate, drew the room's attention, the guest's eyes turning to her with a mix of curiosity and unease. Craddock nodded, his expression skeptical but open. Go on, Miss Marple. What do you mean? She clasped her hands, her eyes sweeping the room. Mr. Gray's confession shows us a heart wounded by rejection, but his intent, he claims, was not murder, if we believe him. Someone else saw his plan and used it, lacing the sugar with cyanide. The sugar bowl, so ordinary, was the perfect trap accessible to all, yet unnoticed. But the heart that planned this was cold, calculating, driven by something deeper than a moment's anger. She paused, letting her words settle, her gaze lingering on each guest in turn. Turning to Clara Voss, she said, Miss Voss, your talent for observation is well known. Your novels capture the flaws of those around you, and Miss Drake's criticism of your work must have stung. Did it stir something stronger than resentment? Clara's eyes flashed, her voice sharp. You're reaching, Miss Marple. Yes, Evelyn's words were cruel, but I don't kill over bad reviews. I was nowhere near the tea table when she took her tea. Her defiance was convincing, but Miss Marple noted the way her fingers tightened around her ring, a nervous gesture that belied her composure. Next, she addressed Colonel Bantry, her tone gentle but probing. Colonel, you spoke of an old debt to Miss Drake's father, a matter of honor. Such burdens can weigh heavily, even years later. Did it trouble you? Perhaps that Evelyn's engagement to Mr. Tate might complicate things. The Colonel's face reddened, his voice a low growl. That debt was settled, Miss Marple, long before Evelyn came of age. I had no reason to harm her. She was a fine girl, full of life. His words were firm, but Miss Marple saw a flicker of relief in his eyes, as if a secret had been laid bare and found harmless. She turned to Dr. Hay, her voice soft but unrelenting. Dr. Hay, your quick recognition of cyanide was remarkable, and your care for Miss Drake's nerves gave you insight into her life. Did she share any fears, perhaps about her suitors or her future? Dr. Hay's spectacles slipped, his hands fumbling to adjust them. She was anxious, yes, about her engagement. She felt pressured, but she never spoke of danger. My knowledge of cyanide is from my training, nothing more. His voice was thin, and Miss Marple noted the sweat on his brow, a sign of unease. That went beyond professional failure. Finally, she addressed Lady Beatrice, who stood rigid, her handkerchief a crumpled knot. Lady Beatrice, you loved Evelyn like a daughter, yet you hinted at her doubts about Mr. Tate and Mr. Gray's devotion to her. Did you see something in her heart? Did she see something in her heart's that might explain this tragedy? Lady Beatrice's eyes filled with tears, her voice breaking. Evelyn was troubled, yes. She cared for Leonard, but Mr. Tate offered security. I thought she'd find happiness, but now her words trailed off, and Miss Marple sensed a deeper grief, perhaps for a choice she had encouraged Craddock. His patience thinning, stepped forward. "Miss Marple, you're suggesting someone used Gray's plan to their own ends. But who, and why?" His voice was sharp, but Miss Marple's smile was calm, her eyes steady. "The human heart, Inspector, is a complex thing." Leonard's anger was known, perhaps by someone close to Evelyn's, someone who saw an opportunity to rid themselves of a rival, a burden, or a threat. The second teacup, untouched, suggests either luck or design, and the crushed cube in the garden, near that hidden bench, points to a moment of haste. The room stirred, the guests exchanging glances, their masks slipping further. Colonel Bantry cleared his throat, his voice quieter now. I suppose I should say, Miss Marple, that Evelyn's father forgave my debt before he died. It was a gesture of friendship, not a burden. I had no reason to wish her harm." His confession, unprompted, hung in the air, and Miss Marple nodded, her eyes crinkling. "Thank you, Colonel. Honesty clarifies things, doesn't it?" Clara Voss, her composure fraying, spoke next, her voice low. "Fine, I'll admit. Words cut deeply. She called my work trivial in front of everyone, and I hated her for it. But murder, I'd rather ruin her in print than poison her tea." Her laugh was bitter, but Miss Marple saw truth in her eyes, a resentment that burned but stopped short of violence. Dr. Hay, his hands trembling, set his notebook aside. "I failed her," he said softly. "I saw her anxiety, but I thought it was just nerves. If I'd been more vigilant, perhaps." His voice broke, and Miss Marple's expression softened, though her mind noted his guilt. Was it professional, or something more? Lady Beatrice, unable to stay silent, stepped forward, her voice trembling. "I pushed Evelyn toward Mr. Tate. I thought it best for her, for the family. Leonard was so unstable. But I never imagined this." Her tears fell, and Miss Marple patted her hand, her touch gentle but her thoughts racing. Had Lady Beatrice's influence stirred a deeper resentment, perhaps in Leonard or another? Craddock, sensing the moment, pressed forward. "These confessions help, but we need evidence. The lab will confirm if the sugar was laced, and we'll match it to Gray's compound or something else. Until then, no one leaves." His voice was firm, but Miss Marple sensed his uncertainty. The case hinged on motives, but the final piece was missing. She returned to her seat, her knitting untouched, her mind weaving the guest's revelations into the pattern. Leonard's confession had exposed his intent, but the cyanide suggested another hand, one that knew his plan and turned it deadly. The sugar bowl, the crushed cube, the second teacup, these were the clues that pointed to a heart driven by more than anger. In St. Mary Mead, she had once solved a murder by noting a misplaced teacup, its position revealing a killer's intent. Here, the pattern was similar, but the stakes were higher, the heart colder. As the clock ticked toward 1, the guests' faces were etched with exhaustion, their masks all but gone. Colonel Bantry's relief, Clara's bitterness, Dr. Hay's guilt, Lady Beatrice's regret was a piece of the human heart, laid bare by the tragedy. Miss Marple, her eyes steady, knew the truth was close, hidden in the interplay of love and loss. The sugar bowl's secret had been partially revealed, but the final thread, the hand that turned a prank into murder, awaited her patient unraveling. Chapter 12. The Final Thread. The Library of Rosewood Manor. Its oak-panelled walls, steeped in the scent of old books and beeswax, had become a crucible where truths were forged in the heat of accusation and confession. The fire in the grate had dwindled to a faint pulse, its embers casting a dim, wavering light across the faces of the guests, who sat in a tense semicircle, their masks of civility all but shattered. The tall windows, framing the darkened rose garden, reflected their strained expressions, each a portrait of unease in the wake of Leonard Gray's partial confession. The mantel clock, its relentless ticking a counterpoint to the room's heavy silence, struck 1 in the morning, its chimes a sombre summons to resolution. Miss Jane Marple sat quietly in her corner, her grey shawl draped neatly over her shoulders, her lavender knitting folded in her lap like a dormant promise. Her spectacles caught the faint firelight, but her eyes, sharp and unyielding, missed nothing. The guests' shifting postures, the flicker of guilt in a glance, the weight of secrets unspoken. Her mind, disciplined as ever, wove together the day's cloister sugar bowls askew lid, the crushed sugar cube in the garden, the untouched second teacup, Mary's whispered account of Leonard's anger, and the torn letters chilling. Phrases now explained by his admission of a prank gone fatally wrong. Yet Leonard's claim that he intended only to bitter Evelyn's tea. Not poison, it suggested a second hand, one that had turned his act into murder. Miss Marple's thoughts, precise as her knitting stitches, sought the final thread to complete the pattern. Inspector Craddock stood at the room's centre, his notebook tucked away, his face a study in weary determination. The guests, there, patience eroded by hours of confinement, watched him with a mix of dread and anticipation. Colonel Bantry, his military bearing softened by exhaustion, sat with his hands clasped, his ruddy face pale. Clara Voss, her burgundy suit creased, leaned forward, her green eyes narrowed but less defiant than before. Dr. Percival, hey, his spectacles polished to a gleam, held his notebook loosely, his thin frame slumped as if burdened by more than fatigue. Lady Beatrice Harrow, her lavender dress a wilted relic, stood near a bookcase, her handkerchief a crumpled knot, her eyes red but resolute. Leonard Gray, returned under escort, stood at the edge, his dark eyes hollow, his hands still trembling from his confession. Craddock's voice cut through the silence, steady but edged with urgency. Mr. Gray's admission that he tampered with the sugar to bitter Miss Drake's teachinges things, but it doesn't close the case. The lab results aren't in, but cyanide killed her, not some harmless compound. Someone knew of his plan and used it, lacing the sugar with poison. I need the truth, now who saw what, who knew what. His eyes swept the room, lingering on, each guest searching for a crack in their facades. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the clock's soft ticking dot. Miss Marple rose, her movements slow but deliberate, her shawl slipping slightly as she addressed the room. Inspector, if I may, murder is a tapestry woven from the human heart, love. Envy, fear, all knotted together. Mr. Gray's confession is a thread, but not the whole pattern. The sugar bowl, so ordinary, was the perfect trap, its granules hiding cyanide. But the heart that planned this was clever, turning a prank into something deadly. Her voice was gentle, almost conversational, but her eyes were piercing, and the guests shifted uncomfortably, sensing her words carried weight beyond their softness. She turned to Leonard, her tone kind but firm. Mr. Gray, you said you acted alone, but did anyone know of your plan? A careless word, perhaps, to a friend or confidant. Leonard's eyes widened, his voice hoarse. No one. I wrote that letter in anger, tore it up. I told no one it was my shame, my mistake. His words were fervent, but Miss Marple noted a flicker of doubt in his gaze, as if he questioned his own secrecy. She nodded, her smile disarming, and turned to the others. "Miss Voss," she said, her eyes meeting Clara's, "your novels show a keen understanding of betrayal. You were quick to call it poison, and your feud with Miss Drake was no secret. Did you see anything near the tea table that might clarify things?" Clara's lips tightened, her voice sharp but controlled. "I've said it before, Miss Marple, I disliked Evelyn, yes, for her smug dismissal of my work. But I was nowhere near that table when she took her tea. I was talking to Mrs. Langley, mocking her dreadful hat. Her tone was defiant, but—" Miss Marple saw the way her hands twisted her ring, a nervous tick that spoke of unease. Next, she addressed Colonel Bantry, her voice warm but probing. "Colonel, your honesty about the debt to Miss Drake's father was commendable, but old ties can bind tightly, can't they? Did you ever resent Evelyn's place in that legacy?" The Colonel's face flushed, his voice low but steady. "I told you, Miss Marple, that debt was forgiven. Evelyn was no threat to me. She was a bright girl, full of promise. I was across the lawn when it happened, telling my stories." His words were firm, but Miss Marple noted the way his eyes flicked to the floor, as if avoiding a deeper truth. Turning to Dr. Hay, she said, "Doctor, your knowledge of cyanide was precise, and your care for Miss Drake gave you insight into her heart. Did she ever hint at a threat, perhaps from someone close?" Dr. Hay's spectacles slipped, his hands fumbling to adjust them. "She was anxious, yes, about her future with Mr. Tate. She felt trapped, but she never spoke of danger. My diagnosis came from experience, nothing more." His voice was thin, and Miss Marple saw the sweat on his brow, a sign of more than professional regret. Finally, she addressed Lady Beatrice, whose posture was rigid, her handkerchief a crumpled relic. "Lady Beatrice, you loved Evelyn dearly, yet you pushed her toward Mr. Tate. Did you sense any danger in her choice, or in those who opposed it?" Lady Beatrice's eyes filled with tears, her voice barely a whisper. "I wanted her secure. Happy, Leonard was so intense, and I feared his passion. But I never thought— not this." Her words broke, and Miss Marple's touch on her arm was gentle, though her mind catalogued the hint of fear in her voice. Craddock, his patience fraying, stepped forward. "Miss Marple, you're circling something. If Gray's telling the truth, who turned his prank into murder, and how?" His voice was sharp, but Miss Marple's smile was serene, her eyes steady. "The sugar bowl, Inspector, was the key, but the crushed cube in the garden near that hidden bench suggests a moment of haste. Someone knew of Mr. Gray's plan, perhaps by chance, and saw an opportunity. The second teacup, untouched, is curious, either a mistake or a deliberate misdirection." The room stirred, the guests' eyes darting to one another. Miss Marple continued, her voice soft but relentless. "I couldn't help but think of the kitchen where Mrs. Benton prepared the tea. She filled the sugar bowl, but it sat in the pantry for a time, unguarded. And Mary, the maid, mentioned seeing someone near the garden gate that morning, not just Mr. Gray, but another figure, too fleeting to identify. The human heart, Inspector, hides its motives, but it leaves traces." Glance, a pause, a cube dropped in haste. She paused, her eyes settling on Dr. Hay, whose hands trembled slightly. "Dr. Hay, you were near the tea table often, weren't you? Checking on Lady Beatrice, perhaps, but also close to the sugar bowl, and your dispensary might it hold." Chemicals like cyanide, even in small amounts. Dr. Hay's face paled, his voice rising. I was only helping. My dispensary has nothing like that. I'd never harm Evelyn, she was my patient. His protest was fervent, but Miss Marple saw the panic in his eyes, a crack in his careful facade. Craddock, seizing the moment, turned to Dr. Hay. Doctor, you'll need to open your dispensary for a search. If there's cyanide there, we'll find it. Dr. Hay's shoulders slumped, his voice barely audible. There's nothing to find, but I did overhear something. Last night, in the hall, I heard Leonard muttering to himself about making her see. I thought it was just anger, but now... His words hung in the air, and the room's tension spiked. The guest's eyes turning to Leonard, who shook his head, his face ashen. Miss Marple nodded, her expression unchanged. Thank you, Doctor, that's helpful. But the heart that planned. This was colder than Mr. Gray's. Someone used his anger, his plan, to mask their own intent. She turned to Clara, her voice gentle. Miss Voss, you're so observant. Did you ever overhear Leonard, or perhaps see someone near the tea table before the party? Clara's eyes narrowed, but she shook her head. I told you, I was busy with Mrs. Langley. I saw nothing. Her voice was steady, but Miss Marple noted the way her fingers stilled, as if guarding a secret. The final thread came unexpectedly, as Mary, the maid, entered with a tray of water glasses, her face pale but resolute. She approached Miss Marple, her voice a whisper. Miss, I remembered something. This morning, in the pantry, I saw Dr. Hay near the sugar bowl. He was just standing there, looking at it, before Mrs. Benton came in. I didn't think it mattered, but now, her words faltered, and Miss Marple's eyes sharpened, though her smile was kind. You've done well, Mary. Don't speak of it yet. Miss Marple turned to Craddock, her voice calm. Inspector, the pantry is worth a look. The sugar bowl sat there, unguarded, before the party. And Dr. Hay's presence there, coupled with his knowledge of cyanide, suggests a possibility we can't ignore. The room gasped, Dr. Hay's face draining of colour. This is absurd, he cried, his voice breaking. I was checking the supplies for Lady Beatrice. She asked me to ensure everything was in order. I'm no murderer. Craddock's eyes narrowed, his voice firm. We'll search the pantry and your dispensary, Doctor. If there's a trace of cyanide, we'll find it. As the constable moved to escort Dr. Hay, Miss Marple sat back, her knitting untouched, her mind weaving the final thread. The human heart Dr. Hay's, perhaps, driven by a hidden motive, had turned Leonard's prank into murder. The sugar bowl, the crushed cube, the second teacup pointed to a plan both bold and subtle, its truth now within reach.